Hey guys, tonight we slip into something ancient silk, maybe, or linen stiff with perfume and sink into the dusky chambers of power, where intimacy wasn't just a whisper between sheets, but a strategy of empire. You are reclining now, warm against the cool stone of a palace floor, candles flickering like stars, and ahead of you, the most famous queen of them all. Cleopatra lounges in a bath thick with rosewater, almond oil, and the faintly sour scent of something less romantic crocodile dung. Yes, that's real. You're about to enter a world where queens turned even the weirdest spa routines into political arsenals. And you probably won't survive this history without questioning everything you thought was just romance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there now? Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge barefoot through the heat-soaked marble corridors of Alexandria's royal complex. It smells like jasmine, goatskin scrolls, and something sharp like vinegar. A eunuch passes by, glances at you, says nothing. Everyone's silent here unless they have something to sell or seduce. At the end of the hall is her chamber, and inside, Cleopatra Cleopatra is not reading poetry, nor counting coins, but testing the consistency of a new face mask made from aged wine, powdered pearl, and yes, crocodile dung. Ancient texts swear by its ability to reduce wrinkles and enhance glow, but that's not why she uses it. Not really. Because Cleopatra is not playing the beauty game, she's playing the power game, and like all brilliant players, she knows what you think you're watching is never what's really going on. She's 21 when she meets Julius Caesar. He's balding, 45, already juggling an empire and a midlife crisis. But Cleopatra doesn't show up trembling in a toga. She arrives rolled up inside a rug, unannounced, uninvited, and perfectly aware that her presence would scandalize, thrill, and disarm the most militarized man in the Mediterranean. That wasn't seduction, it was performance art. Historians still argue whether Caesar loved her, admired her, or simply wanted a puppet queen in Egypt. But what's certain is that she wrapped herself not just around him, but around the very myth of Rome itself. And he let her. Because sex isn't just about the body, it's about story. Cleopatra made sure she was unforgettable. And she didn't stop with Caesar. When he died, she reeled in Mark Antony, Rome's other war-hardened ego on legs. But this time, the seduction was different, less mystery, more theater. They became known for elaborate banquets featuring purple-dyed fountains and pearls dissolved in vinegar for fun. She reportedly bet Antony she could host the most expensive dinner in history and won, simply by drinking the pearl. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about spectacle. Cleopatra turned intimacy into ritual, desire into diplomacy. They weren't sleeping together. They were staging politics in the language of pleasure. And she was always the better writer. One evening, after a particularly extravagant wine-drenched feast, Cleopatra allegedly performed a rite said to be sacred to Isis. According to some Egyptian priesthood accounts, the queen of the Nile would lie on an altar, covered in myrrh and saffron, and receive visions between bouts of intimacy, channeling divine feminine energy directly into the veins of her partner. It sounds mystical, but Cleopatra was always calculating. These weren't just rituals, they were metaphors. When she lay with a Roman, Egypt wasn't submitting, it was binding Rome to its soil. And then there's the crocodile dung. People today still raise an eyebrow at the idea that Cleopatra used it in contraceptives, applied vaginally with honey and acacia leaves. Which, by the way, might have actually worked due to the acidity acting as a spermicide. Quirky very, but this concoction wasn't just for reproductive control, it was symbolic. By inserting elements of the Nile, the creature most feared and revered, into her most private self. Cleopatra declared her body a temple, a trap, and a treaty all at once. She owned every inch of it, and everyone who came near. In fact, in Egyptian art, the queen isn't shown lounging as passive beauty. She's carved standing firm, arm in arm with gods, equal in size to male rulers. Her portraits on coinage showed her with a hooked nose and strong jaw, not because she lacked vanity,
but because she modeled herself after Alexander the Great. She understood that softness could win trust, but edge won thrones. By blending femininity with strength, beauty with brains, she broke binaries before there were even words for them.
Still, people keep asking. Was Cleopatra really beautiful? Plutarch said it wasn't her looks, but her irresistible charm.
Scholars still argue whether that was code for manipulation or genius. You look at her coins now and wonder, was she attractive? Or did she just convince the world she was irreplaceable? And maybe that's the real question. Because seduction, when wielded by a queen, isn't about appearances. It's about authorship. Cleopatra wrote her own myth while the men around her were busy stabbing each other in the back, literally and figuratively.
One Roman official once noted that her voice was musical, able to shift tones mid-conversation to match whatever language her listener thought was native. She spoke at least 9 languages fluently, which meant pillow talk with her could come with footnotes, historical context, and legal disclaimers. You don't survive a male-dominated world for over 2 decades by being decorative. You do it by mastering translation of tongues, of cultures, of hearts. But here's the tragic irony for all her power. Cleopatra's end came not on a battlefield, but in a private room, cornered by Octavian's forces, watching Antony die in her arms after a failed suicide. She chose her final weapon. Maybe it was an asp. Maybe a poisoned hairpin no one knows for sure. But she made her death a performance too. Dressed in her royal robes, lying on a golden bed, she exited the world the same way she'd entered Rome's imagination unforgettable, undecoded, and on her own terms.
And somewhere beneath all that incense and silk, there's a woman who knew something the main men never quite figured out. Control is never loud. It's perfumed, whispered, and sometimes smeared in crocodile dung.
You're standing now on the scorched sand of Kush, just south of Egypt, the sun cruel and deliberate overhead. The kind of sun that doesn't just burn, it interrogates. And there she is, Queen Amanirenas riding a chariot pulled by war horses whose hooves crush the bones of Roman ambition. But tonight, she's not wielding a spear or delivering speeches. Tonight, she's lying in her tent, missing one eye, cloaked in leopard skins, whispering lullabies that aren't for children. You see, Amanirenas didn't just fight Augustus Caesar to a draw, she seduced empire itself into questioning its masculinity. The Romans called her a barbarian. They also couldn't stop writing about her. And not just because she led troops into battle with a bow taller than herself, but because she made generals dream of her, wake in cold sweat, then go back to fighting anyway. It starts with silence. You're inside her tent now, where the air is thick with cardamom and roasted coffee. The walls are goatskin, the ceiling low, the rugs worn from ritual and war. Beside her lies a Roman prisoner not bound, not bruised, just deeply confused. He's trying to understand why this queen hasn't executed him. Instead, she's feeding him honey-dipped dates and asking about Rome's latest siege taxes. She leans in, speaks in broken Latin, lets her fingers brush the rim of his goblet. He drinks. That's her battlefield now language. Proximity, disorientation. Later that night, he'll admit to hearing her voice in his dreams, somewhere between a growl and a hymn. Historians still argue whether Amanirenas used captives as political tools, or if she simply enjoyed rearranging their expectations like furniture. What's agreed upon is that her sensuality didn't weaken her authority, it reinforced it. She was feared precisely because she didn't flinch at weaponizing softness. She lost an eye during battle. The story goes that when Augustus saw her portrait, he asked if it was an insult. Her messengers replied she lost it fighting his legions. And still he couldn't win. You imagine her smiling as they said it. Picture this, a queen with one eye, blood on her tunic, still smeared with gold from ceremony, standing atop a Roman fortress she just retook, placing a severed bronze head of Augustus under her feet. That's not just war, that's theater. And sex, at least in the psychological sense, is always theatrical. It's about who controls the script. One lesser-known tale tells of Amanirenas holding what might have been a ritualized union with a captured Roman centurion, not as punishment, but as a kind of strategic humiliation. He was well-fed, clothed, even respected, but every night, called to her tent, given sweet wine, and asked to discuss Roman politics while she braided her hair slowly, sensually, and sometimes silently. After weeks, he reportedly asked to stay in Kush, offering intelligence in return. Whether or not this occurred exactly that way, the logic holds she knew desire could erase loyalty. She didn't need to torture him, just unmoor him. And it wasn't just him. Amanirenas maintained a court that included men and women from across Africa and the Mediterranean, many of whom were bound to her not through treaties, but intimacy, shared meals, whispered dreams, and yes, carefully orchestrated encounters that blurred the line between comfort and captivity. One Greek scribe called her terrifyingly tender. Another Roman diplomat refused to eat or speak for days after returning from her court, claiming he'd been enchanted. Her enemies didn't accuse her of witchcraft, they feared her for subtler reasons. She made war feel like heartbreak. Here's a quirky little detail: she supposedly wore anklets shaped like lion jaws, hollowed out and filled with scented oils. As she walked, the heat of her skin would warm the metal, releasing perfume. Imagine the psychological effect of your conqueror's scent arriving seconds before her footsteps. She didn't enter rooms, she enveloped them. One Kushite poem, Almost Lost to Time, describes the queen not in terms of lineage or military glory, but in the rhythm of her hips as she walked among her court. Her stride said to echo the movement of the Nile itself. Unrushed, inevitable, and impossible to dam. It also references how the men did not speak until her eyes blinked once. A single blink. That was her signal for silence to end. That's not vanity, that's choreography. And still, the Roman records fixate on her missing eye. They couldn't make sense of it. In their world, female beauty was always about symmetry, passivity, submission. Amanirenas broke all that. She was asymmetrical, aggressive, and absolutely sovereign. Yet there were whispers, maybe from Roman deserters or local priests, that she wore a single golden contact over the hollow, polished to a mirror so that those who looked directly into it saw only themselves. If true, that's either terrifying or poetic. Probably both. And yet, she wasn't cruel. She rebuilt cities. She forgave rebels. She instituted fertility rites, in which male priests danced for female landowners, a full reversal of traditional gender power dynamics. During these festivals, it's said she would appear not in armor, but in robes scented with henna and blue lotus, distributing flowers instead of orders. But everyone still bowed. They always bowed. Because her authority came from something deeper than violence. It came from proximity, how close she let you get before she decided what part of you she'd keep. You start to wonder now, what if control has always been like this? Not shouted, but whispered. Not taken, but offered. Then withdrawn. Amanirenas mastered the art of making herself seem available, only to remain unreachable. Her intimacy wasn't vulnerability, it was provocation. And in the end, Rome signed a treaty with her, not with Kush, not with her advisors, with Amanirenas. No taxes, no tribute, just peace brokered by a woman with one eye, an anklet that hissed perfume, and a strategy built not on legions, but on presence. And when she died, her tomb wasn't filled with weapons. It held mirrors, crushed gemstones, letters from distant rulers, and what some believe to be the preserved tongues of former enemies, each wrapped in silk. Whether symbolic or literal, you get the message. She wasn't just the eye of the storm. She was the storm that watched you watching her. She was the silence that made kings stutter. You're in Luanda now. Though it's not called that yet. The air is wet with incense and blood, and somewhere between the coastal breeze and the prayers of enslaved tongues, you hear the soft shuffle of bare feet on polished stone. Queen Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba is not walking, she's gliding, waist deep in politics, crowned in a halo of dreadlocked intrigue. Her court smells like musk, sandalwood, and betrayal. Tonight, the Portuguese envoy waits outside her door, sweating into his velvet sleeves, while Njinga prepares not just her words, but her body, because diplomacy here doesn't wear armor, it wears skin, and Njinga, as always, is ready to perform the most disorienting seduction of all, one where everyone in the room thinks they're in control. until they realize they're not even part of the script. You find yourself ushered into her court. It's a hybrid space part Catholic chapel, part Mbundu ceremonial hall. Crucifixes hang beside ancestral masks. Latin prayers interrupted by drums. Njinga sits on a human throne, literally. A slave kneels beneath her, acting as her seat. You've heard the tale. Maybe. That when the Portuguese denied her a chair at negotiations, she made her own from flesh. But what they miss is that it wasn't just a power move, it was a message. Her body would not be lower than any man's, and no foreign throne would define her posture. That was Njinga's style turn every insult into theater, every expectation into a trap. She didn't just outmaneuver empires, she made them sweat. Her relationships were both tactical and theatrical. She kept a rotating harem of male concubines, often dressed as women, who she referred to as her wives. Each was chosen not for looks, but for strategic utility, one a master archer, one a translator, one a former Jesuit. Before certain battles, she would engage in ceremonial intimacy with one or several of them, invoking ancestral spirits said to guide her military visions. These rites weren't secret, they were staged, sometimes publicly, sometimes behind a veil thin enough to tempt scandal. And yes, it scandalized the Portuguese, who couldn't decide if she was possessed, mad, or simply ahead of her time. Historians still argue whether these rituals were spiritual performances, sexual orgies, or just brilliant psychological warfare. But what's certain is that every moan, every sigh, every tender bite was curated to unsettle the enemy and unify her troops. One chronicler described an event where Njinga, on the eve of signing a temporary peace with a Portuguese governor, invited him to a night of native celebration. He was expecting drums, perhaps wine, maybe a little flattery. Instead, he watched as Njinga performed a slow dance with one of her male wives, both dressed in feathers, their bodies painted with symbols of death and rebirth. They circled each other, touched palms, mimed combat and caress, then disappeared into her quarters. The governor never saw the man again. When he asked, Njinga said softly, he returned to the ancestors, as we all must, after serving the queen. No further questions were asked. It wasn't just about pleasure, it was about perception. Njinga understood that the colonizers came with categories woman, man, heathen, queen, savage, convert. She shattered each one by being all of them at once. One day she'd dress in full priestess garb, sacrificing a chicken while chanting Tanzambi. The next she'd wear a crucifix and quote Corinthians. She married men, women, and sometimes nations. And in every relationship, intimacy was wielded like a knife, sometimes gentle, sometimes slicing, always deliberate. You learn about a specific night, recounted in the oral tradition, when Njinga summoned 2 rival ambassadors into her chamber. They were told it was for mediation. Inside, they found her reclining on a bed of red cloth, flanked by 2 lovers, one fanning her, the other playing the lute. She asked each man to step forward and state his case. As they spoke, she alternated her attention one moment stroking the fan-bearer's thigh, the next biting into a fig. Her listening was punctuated by slow, deliberate sips of palm wine. Eventually, the rivals began arguing not with her, but with each other. She watched, amused, then dismissed them both with a single sentence. The queen is already satisfied. Days later, one was found drowned in a stream. The other defected to her side. Quirkier still was Njinga's use of scent. It said she infused her skin oils with medicinal herbs, cassava leaf, marula, wild sage not just for allure, but for psychological dominance. Portuguese commanders reported feeling entranced after meeting her, even when no words were exchanged. One priest recorded that her perfume clung to the soul like temptation. She used scent like a fingerprint custom, haunting, impossible to replicate. She also knew the power of proximity. Once, when negotiating a truce, she insisted the Portuguese envoy sleep in her palace, not in a guest room, in her bedchamber. He agreed eager, perhaps, or naive. But when night fell, Njinga did not appear. Instead, he was visited hourly by her wives, who whispered riddles, fed him aphrodisiacs, then vanished. By dawn, he hadn't slept a minute. When Njinga finally arrived, dressed as a warrior, she greeted him with a smirk. Yeah, you understand negotiation. The envoy agreed to all her terms. Still, questions remain. Was she sincere in her affections? Or was everything performance? Did she ever love? Or only calculate? Did the concubines she kept whisper secrets back to her at night? Or were they as dazed as her enemies? Scholars debate endlessly. But the oral historians of Angola say this: she ruled with her entire self-mind, mouth, body, breath, and that, they argue, is why she endured. And endure she did. When betrayed by allies, she seduced their replacements. When priests demanded her conversion, she baptized herself, then built shrines in her basement to older gods. She lived into her 80s, ruling through whispers and caresses long after most of her enemies had either bowed or disappeared. She didn't just survive colonization, she danced circles around it. Her body, like her mind, became a language, one that Portuguese missionaries could neither translate nor silence. They wrote frantically about her in their diaries, often with awe disguised as disgust. One priest described her as a serpent made flesh, but even he admitted her words lingered like hymns. Another admitted under interrogation that he'd once dreamed of her every night for a week, despite never meeting her. You imagine Njinga hearing this, laughing, then lighting another scented candle. Because for her, rule was never just about thrones and taxes. It was about who could own the space between two people who could turn a glance into a command, a kiss into a campaign. She knew something the world still pretends not to, that the most powerful kind of domination is the one you mistake for choice. You're winding now through the cinnamon-thick winds of the Arabian desert, though your feet never leave the African soil. Beneath you, the dust of ancient Ethiopia clings to your ankles. And ahead, glowing in the gold shimmer of twilight, is a procession of camels, musicians, and silk-draped servants. At its center rides a woman draped in layers of myrrh-scented linen, her posture a blend of serenity and command. This is Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, and tonight, she's not merely traveling to meet King Solomon, she's staging the slowest seduction in biblical history. Not with a kiss, but with clove-laced wine, unblinking eye contact, and enough spicy questions to make a philosopher sweat. And no, you don't need to believe in the Bible to believe in her power. She doesn't wait for validation from the scrolls of men. She wrote herself into history by walking straight into its most guarded palace, then whispering her terms with honey on her lips. The story is always told from Solomon's side, like he was the sun she revolved around. But you're there now, behind the veil, in her traveling pavilion lit with bronze lanterns and the sound of tambourines. She's not nervous, she's rehearsing. A queen from the Sabaean kingdom doesn't cross a continent to flirt. Gan arrives with trade routes in her eyes and alliances hidden beneath her jewelry. Her robes are stitched with coded messages in Himyaritic script. And the spices she brings aren't just gifts, they're symbols. Cinnamon for longevity, frankincense for divinity, myrrh for seduction, and tucked between those jars, scrolls of diplomatic questions she intends to slide into conversation like a blade between ribs. Not to kill, just to test the reflexes. When she finally meets Solomon, it's not in a garden or a candlelit room, but a hall of judgment where, in theory, he holds the advantage. But Makeda doesn't blink. She arrives, perfumed, poised, and already amused. The moment they exchange pleasantries, she throws out a riddle. What walks without legs, weeps without eyes, and sings without a mouth? Solomon pauses. Water, he says. She smiles. He's right, but now the room is hers. Riddles are not just games here, they're dominance displays. Each one a flirtation shaped like a trap. The Book of Kings mentions her briefly, politely, but Ethiopian legends tell a richer tale. They say she stayed for months, that the conversations got deeper, the glances longer, and eventually, there was a night, one night, in his chambers, lit with oil lamps and thick with incense. She dined beside him. When he offered her wine, she took it slowly. When he prayed, she listened. When he reached for her hand, she didn't move it away, but she also didn't speak. Silence became her power move. And that night, depending on who tells it, they shared more than just words. Sex, in this context, isn't mechanical, it's ceremonial. The Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's ancient epic, claims that Solomon seduced her by trickery, getting her to agree not to take anything from his house unless offered. Then, placing a glass of water beside her bed, knowing she'd reach for it. And when she did, he appeared and reminded her of the oath. She laughed. He kissed her. What followed, according to legend, wasn't conquest, but communion. And from that night, a child was born, Menelik I, who would become the first emperor of Ethiopia, founding a dynasty that claimed direct descent from both Makeda and Solomon. Real or not, it's one hell of a birth story. Historians still argue whether Makeda existed at all, or whether she was a symbolic stand-in for a wider matriarchal tradition in ancient African and Arabian trade networks. But records from the Sabaean kingdom speak of a powerful female ruler, unmatched in negotiation, who traveled north with a caravan heavy in both spice and questions. And as always, where history gets fuzzy, power gets sharper. Because regardless of the literal truth, the legend of Makeda endured not because she was Solomon's guest, but because she left with more than she came with. There's an apocryphal fragment that suggests Makeda had a practice before long journeys she would bathe in a mixture of milk, rosewater, and crushed amber. Then have a courtesan recite poetry to her while brushing her hair with a comb carved from ivory and obsidian. It was not vanity, it was priming. A queen must arrive smelling like myth. Every follicle had a function. One Portuguese explorer in the 15th century, hearing tales of her ritual, commented that the very idea of her bath lingered in the desert air for centuries. That's how legends ferment slowly, fragrantly. The quirkiest part. Ethiopian folktale claims Makeda's feet were hooves. Yes, goat-like. This wasn't an insult, it was a symbol. In ancient folklore, animal feet were a sign of otherworldliness, a connection to the divine. When Solomon first saw her ankles, he apparently ordered water poured across the floor to make her lift her robes and reveal her feet. She did. No one gasped. She didn't apologize. She simply said, "A woman of the earth walks as the earth does." That line alone should be on a t-shirt. But here's the real twist. After the encounter, Makeda doesn't stay. She leaves. Solomon offers her treasures. She takes them, but she also takes her time. She walks away not in disgrace, not in shame, but in complete command. Back in her kingdom, she rules for years, long enough for myths to build staircases around her name, long enough for her son to return to Jerusalem, not to beg, but to borrow the Ark of the Covenant, yes, that one, and bring it back to Ethiopia. The tale says it was with divine blessing. Maybe. Or maybe it was with Makeda's planning. Because seduction is not about what you take, it's about what you leave behind echoing. The true echo of Makeda isn't in the scrolls or the statues. It's in how later queens model themselves. In how her blend of spiritual mystery and political savvy became a template. In how her smile, however imagined, still makes even kings hesitate before they speak. She ruled not with armies, but with tempo, with the timing of her questions, the thickness of her silences, and the way her presence turned every interaction into a negotiation of breath. And for a woman said to have feet like a goat, she sure knew how to make entire civilizations kneel. You're crouching now beneath a moonless sky in the highlands of North Africa, where the wind carries sand like whispered secrets. Before you, a flickering line of torches winds up a jagged hill toward the Berber camp. In this harsh silence, you don't hear trumpets or drums. You hear something softer, the rustle of silk against leather, the low hum of a war chant braided with lullabies. And there she stands, Dihi al-Kahina, her cloak stitched with eagle feathers, her face a map of smudged coal and absolute conviction. You may have read that she was a prophetess, a priestess, a military leader, but tonight, you'll meet her as something else entirely, a queen who commanded not only armies, but beds. Because when Dihea faced conquest, she didn't just raise swords, she laced her resistance with intimacy sharp enough to wound. She's often remembered as the last queen to resist the Islamic conquest of North Africa in the 7th century.
But her methods were more than battlefield strategy. She didn't simply defy the caliphate, she confused it. Her court was nomadic, unpredictable. One night, it might be all military councils and Spartan meals. The next, a tent draped in tapestries where dancers moved in hypnotic spirals, and lovers were chosen not by rank, but by riddles. Dihya treated seduction as smoke, a way to disorient, to obscure intention. Her bedchamber was known by her inner circle as the wind room, not because it was cold, but because no one left it the same.
There's a tale, passed down more in whispers than in ink, of a captured general brought into her presence after a failed siege. Instead of chaining him, she dressed him in white, perfumed him, and invited him to dine. They ate flatbread with honey, figs roasted over fire, and bitter black tea laced with cloves. All the while, she asked him questions about his family, his youth, the poems he liked. Then, just as the moon hit its apex, she asked him to lie beside her, not for sex, but for silence, just to listen to her breathing. He wept, not from fear, but from the unraveling of everything he thought he knew about conquest. Days later, he defected to her side. Historians still argue whether this was a true romance or a calculated defection. But what matters is that she didn't have to strike him to break him. She just had to make him feel safe, then completely exposed. She wasn't above violence. Oh no. Dihya's forces razed cities, burned supply lines, and melted coins to fund rebellions. But her genius was in creating dual realities, one where her enemies saw her as monstrous beastly even, with unbound hair and blood on her sword, and one where her lovers, both male and female, described her as the calm between two storms. There's a report from a Jewish merchant who claimed she wore no jewelry but smelled like every spice God made. He'd encountered her only once, delivering silks, and yet dreamed of her scent for years after. That's not perfume. That's presence. One of the strangest things about Dihya was how she blurred the line between lover and spy. In her retinue were women trained not just in seduction, but in infiltration. A group called the Night Veil Sisters, reportedly 12 of them, whose main duty was to embed themselves into enemy camps as entertainers, only to return with strategies, schedules, and secrets. Some say Dihya herself would occasionally disguise as one of them, slip into tents, and watch her enemies sleep. If she liked what she saw, she'd leave a single date fruit behind. If she didn't, nothing. That alone turned the date fruit into a symbol of fate in certain Berber tribes, sweetness you only received if the queen spared you. But let's talk about her personal lovers, the ones she kept close. According to some regional folklore, Dihya maintained a strict rotation, 3 lovers per season, each selected for symbolic reasons, a warrior, to reflect her strength, a musician, to mirror her soul, and a scribe, to record her dreams. They lived with her not as consorts, but as extensions of her rule. Each night, before battle plans were drawn, she'd share a moment of intimacy with one not always sexual, but always charged. One evening, it might be a back massage while she read star charts. Another, a bath shared in total silence while sipping camel milk steeped with mint and ash. Nothing about her affections were routine, which, ironically, made them more dangerous. You never knew if you were being seduced, interrogated, or simply studied. Then there's the prophecy angle. People forget that Kahina wasn't her name, it meant the seer. She was believed to have visions, often after the ritual acts of intimacy. She'd retreat with a lover to a private tent, emerge hours later, and declare a military decision. This blurred line between divine foresight and physical connection unnerved her enemies. To them, a woman who mixed sex with strategy must be evil. To her people, it meant the gods had a favorite, a quirk of her rule. She banned metal mirrors in her court. Instead, women were required to see themselves reflected only in polished bowls of water. The belief was that water changed with emotion. Your reflection shifted based on your mood. If you appeared still and strong, you were ready to serve. If you looked nervous or fragmented, you were not. Dihya reportedly used this ritual before every intimate encounter, not for vanity, but for clarity. If the water rippled too much, she sent the partner away. Her final battle, of course, is the stuff of tragedy. cornered by Arab forces, outnumbered, betrayed by those she once trusted. But even then, she didn't surrender. She reportedly kissed each of her remaining soldiers on the forehead, no speech, no ceremony, and rode into death with her cloak on fire. Some say she killed herself to avoid capture. Others say she escaped, changed identity, and ruled from the shadows. But in every version, she left behind a string of broken hearts and confused invaders who never quite understood how they lost. And maybe that's the point. Dihya didn't fight like a general. She fought like a fever dream, beautiful, brutal, and unforgettable. Her intimacy wasn't a weakness. It was her most dangerous weapon. She made conquest feel consensual, then flipped the terms. She made love feel like surrender, then turned it into strategy. And when she was gone, even her enemies admitted they missed her. Now you find yourself under a sky streaked with copper and indigo, where the Nubian desert hums like a sleeping animal. The air tastes of sandstone and smoke, and in the distance, a temple looms not grand like the pyramids of Giza, but intimate, cloaked in secrets. This is the domain of the priestess queen, a woman so entwined with the divine that no man could tell where prophecy ended and seduction began. Here, in the heart of ancient Nubia, intimacy isn't a private act, it's sacred diplomacy. And you, standing barefoot on the cool floor of her sanctum, are about to witness how a whisper in the dark could command legions just as effectively as a decree in the daylight. You don't know her name, no one does. Her identity was erased, rebranded, or perhaps deliberately hidden. But she ruled not through bloodline or conquest, but through dreams hers, and those she placed in others. By day, she appeared serene, draped in indigo robes scented with papyrus and crushed hibiscus, performing rituals before altars carved with sun discs and stars. By night, she walked alone, always barefoot, always silent. It's said she would lie beside kings, not always for sex, though that happened too, but to listen. Just listen. To their fears, their ambitions, their softest admissions muttered into the pillows between waking and sleep. And from those murmurings, she would divine political trajectories. In one well-documented case, she predicted the failure of a Nubian expedition into Lower Egypt, not by examining battle plans, but by interpreting the governor's recurring dream of a horse drowning in honey. She whispered her interpretation after a night spent at his side, and the next morning, he canceled the mission. A week later, a flood wiped out the route entirely. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether this priestess queen manipulated the governors into fulfilling her visions or truly foresaw events. But what remains is the record etched faintly into temple walls of her voice being considered a higher authority than steel. Her lovers were often not lovers at all. One trader wrote that she invited him into her chamber not to touch him, but to watch him sleep. For 3 nights, she asked no questions, just burned scented resin, murmured songs in a forgotten dialect, and placed her fingers on his chest as he breathed. On the 4th night, she told him to return home and sell all his turquoise. The mines will flood by the next new moon. He did. They did. He became wealthy. He left her offerings every year after, including what is believed to be the first written contract of trade bound not by ink, but by dream. The chamber where these encounters occurred was known as the honey room. It had no windows, only a skylight that let moonlight spill onto a central bed carved from ebony and overlaid with black linen. A copper bowl in the corner hissed with herbs thyme, blue lotus, a pinch of nutmeg. In one corner, a harpist played until the queen nodded once for silence. Everything was ritual. You weren't invited in, you were summoned. And when you left, you never spoke of it, not because she asked for secrecy, but because words didn't work after that. And yet she was not aloof. Among her people, she walked freely. She blessed newborns, drank tamarind wine with elders, and danced during harvest festivals with her bare feet in the mud. But every few weeks, she disappeared, vanishing into her temple with a guest of her choosing. The guest could be a noble, a traveler, even a captured enemy. What mattered wasn't their status, but their dreams. She selected them by listening. If someone dreamed in color, if they muttered names that didn't exist. If their sleep came restless, these were signs. She believed power revealed itself in the subconscious, and that the strongest leaders were those most tangled in their own mysteries. Quirky detail. She kept a garden of night-blooming flowers, moon lilies, ghost jasmine, and a rare desert orchid that only opened once a month. Before choosing her nightly companion, she would pluck one bloom and crush it between her palms. If the scent was strong, she chose a guest. If it was faint, she remained alone. The priestesses said the flowers spoke to her. The guests didn't argue. One surviving fragment of poetry, believed to be authored by her, says, "The body is not a gate, but a mirror. Those who cross it see themselves more clearly." She didn't seduce with body alone, she seduced with meaning. Her intimacy was never passive. To lie with her was to be read, dissected, rewritten. Kings left her chambers not with erections, but with decisions. One changed his entire taxation policy after a night with her. Another abdicated. She didn't issue commands. She made you realize what you feared to admit. The Greeks, who later encountered Nubian culture, were terrified of her legend. They translated her as a siren, a temptress, a sorceress. But to her people, she was the moon's translator. They say her voice could stop an argument just by entering a room. Her critics claimed she never fought in battle, but her influence outlived generals. Long after her death, other queens styled their temples after hers. No windows, only moonlight. And still, historians puzzle over her role. Was she a queen or a priestess? Was she chosen by the gods? Or did she just know how to read people better than anyone alive? Was her intimacy sacred or strategic? These debates fill symposiums and dissertations. But to the people who knelt at her altars, she was something else entirely. A woman who could hold your hand as you slept and change the trajectory of your life by the way she exhaled. They say her final vision came to her in a dream shared with a stranger, an old man with scars who had never seen the ocean but dreamed of waves. She held his face in her palms and whispered, "There will be a flood of swords, but your son will live." That man's son went on to lead a peaceful trade coalition that outlasted the warring kingdoms by 3 centuries. She didn't leave behind a tomb. She left behind a shadow, a set of instructions whispered from one woman to another over centuries. You can still find echoes of her rituals in parts of Sudan, where women gather once a month under the moon and burn herbs in copper bowls, breathing stories into the sky. They don't call it magic. They call it remembering. Now you're walking beside the Nile again. Only this time it's dusk, and the river seems to exhale, thick with memory and mosquitoes. The breeze carries the scent of papyrus, warm milk, and something spiced, maybe clove or the sweat of devotion. Ahead of you, torches circle a tomb, not a funeral, but a rite. There's music, soft and unhurried, the kind played not for celebration, but transformation. You're not at a battlefield or a royal court now. You're at a grave. And what's happening here beneath a sycamore tree, beside the sacred river, is both sacred and surprisingly carnal. Because in this chapter of forgotten African queenship, intimacy isn't just about love or lust. It's about eternity. You're witnessing funerary sex. And before you can recoil, understand this to ancient Egyptians and their Nubian neighbors. Sex wasn't just for the living, it was how queens sealed their claim to the afterlife. Tonight, the queen is unnamed in our records. She's simply she who breathes among the dead. But her legend still floats through temple carvings and scratched graffiti along tomb walls. Her body, freshly bathed in oils from date kernels and lotus petals, is wrapped in linen so sheer it's practically symbolic. She kneels beside the open tomb of her late husband, a pharaoh or noble. No one agrees, and before her is a high priest, masked in gold, cloaked in black, chosen for one task only to bring her pleasure. This is not a sacrifice. This is a ceremony. She does not mourn, she claims. The idea comes from a real belief that orgasm, especially in sacred rites, could act as a metaphysical bridge. In some interpretations of the pyramid texts, a pharaoh's journey to the afterlife depended not only on the preservation of his body, but on the completion of certain acts that echoed fertility and creation. While male priests performed symbolic rituals, Some queens chose to make it literal. They'd enter the tombs of their dead husbands or royal partners and engage in a carefully timed ritual of climax, usually timed with moonrise or the flooding of the Nile, not for pleasure alone, but for power. The act was believed to anchor their own divinity, tether their soul to the dead, and absorb a fragment of their spiritual authority. It was sex as succession.
Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread, rare, or simply poetic exaggeration recorded by temple artists who liked drama. But we do have physical spaces carved into tomb complexes small, isolated chambers with beds, incense grooves, and sometimes mirrors. Not for sleeping, for transforming. One tomb inscription tells of a queen who wept not for her husband, but sang above his body until the stars forgot their names. That same inscription describes union between breath and silence, a phrase many believe refers to ritual intercourse. Whether symbolic or literal, the intimacy was meant to activate the body of the dead, not to raise them, but to confirm their passage, like stamping a passport to eternity. One actual documented rite involves the goddess Isis and her dead husband, Osiris. In myth, she brings him back to life briefly by reassembling his dismembered body and engaging in intercourse with him, resulting in the birth of Horus. This myth wasn't just bedtime storytelling. It was theology. Queens aligned themselves with Isis, especially in Nubian traditions, not only in worship, but in ritualized behavior. And just like Isis, they used intimacy not to please, but to create power. And like every queen worth her coal, they turned myth into method.
There's one particularly curious account from the late 25th dynasty. A royal widow, likely a Kushite queen, insisted that her husband's tomb be consecrated with 3 nights of sacred union, during which she remained secluded with a chosen priest. At sunrise each morning, she emerged veiled in gold, poured honey over the tomb's threshold, and recited a poem comparing her breath to the wind that moved boats across the Nile. The poem survives, in part, chiseled awkwardly on a temple wall. Let the river remember how we moved. Let the reeds whisper his name where I kissed it into the air. Not exactly bureaucratic prose, but it tells us something. This was about more than grief. It was erotic memory as political continuity. And the details get stranger. Some queens reportedly used aphrodisiacs mixed with crushed blue lotus, desert truffle, and fermented barley. They were anointed from head to toe not just in oil, but with a paste made of ground pomegranate seeds and date sap, believed to awaken ancestral fire. And yes, they wore jewelry, not rings or crowns, but pelvic chains etched with symbols of Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and fertility. These chains weren't decorative. They jingled softly with each movement, believed to ward off evil spirits and signal to the divine realm that the rite was in progress. The act itself, whatever form it took, was less about climax and more about communion. One ritual text advises the queen to inhale before the moment, so that the breath may carry what the mouth dares not speak. That phrase still gives modern translators a headache, but the intent is clear. The body was a vessel, not just of lineage, but of memory. Sex was less about 2 people and more about binding timelines. And here's a quirky tidbit. One tomb contains a single preserved sandal, tiny, red-dyed leather, clearly meant for a woman. It was placed not on the queen's body, but at the feet of a male mummy. The sandal's strap was tied in a knot known symbolically as the embrace of Isis. Scholars have no official explanation. Some say it was a marker of sacred union. Others think it was a personal token. But local oral traditions say that when a queen gave you her sandal, it meant she would join you again in the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of heaven. So somewhere in the afterlife, a barefoot queen might still be walking toward her lover. There are also debates about whether queens used sex in tomb rituals to extend their own lives. One particularly haunting passage from the Temple of Dhaka warns, "She who forgets the rites shall sleep without stars, but she who joins flesh with spirit shall rise again with morning sails." Translation intimacy was a contract with time. You did the ritual not just for the dead, but to make sure your own name echoed for generations. And for queens, names were everything. Once your name was forgotten, you were erased from existence. These acts, these private ceremonies in shadowed halls, were strategies of immortality. The priestesses who assisted in these rites were not passive observers. They orchestrated the timing, the music, even the temperature of the room by managing incense and airflow. One group, known as the Handmaidens of Breath, were trained in dream interpretation and erotic symbolism. Their job was to guide the queen's rhythm physically and spiritually to ensure the rite achieved its mystical target. Think less Kama Sutra and more metaphysical choreography. And then the ritual would end, not with applause, not with tears, but with silence. The queen would don her outer robes, emerge beneath the rising sun, and pour water into the soil as a final offering. And in that moment, all boundaries, life and death, grief and desire, memory and myth would blur. And then, they say, she would smile. Because in that smile was the truth. Queens like her always knew that real power isn't written in law or chiseled in stone. It's whispered in the dark, echoed in breath, and passed from one body to the next until even the gods have to listen. You're standing in the highlands of southern Africa now, where the hills roll like sleeping giants beneath the mist, and the grass whispers as it bends with the wind. This isn't desert or kingdom. It's a queendom built from rhythm, fertility, and beer. Yes, beer. You walk into a village preparing for a ceremony, and the air smells like roasted maize, clay ovens, and fermented barley. Children dart between huts, elders hum old melodies, and at the center of it all, dressed in layers of ochre-dusted cloth and draped in beadwork that shimmers like dew, is the Rain Queen. Her name. It changes with the seasons. Mojaji. They call her every generation reborn with the same title. And while the world sees only a woman on a hill, her people know better. She is the reason the clouds gather. And sometimes, when the fields are too dry or the men too loud, she doesn't just summon rain, she summons attention with her hips, her rituals, and a carefully brewed batch of ceremonial beer that's a lot more potent than it looks. The Balabedu Rain Queens have ruled for centuries, quietly and without fanfare. No wars, no coronations carved in stone, just influence soaked into the soil itself. These queens were said to possess the power to control rainfall through secret rituals passed from mother to daughter. But the real trick was in how they ruled with so little resistance. While kings built castles and swung swords, the Rain Queens swayed hips and brewed beer. And somehow, their rule endured longer. That wasn't magic, it was intimacy as governance. On certain nights, the Rain Queen would host fertility festivals. These weren't public orgies or wild bacchanals. They were slow, deliberate performances, laced with metaphor and thick with expectation. The queen wouldn't even appear until the music had been playing for hours, until the beer had frothed into the earth and the village was already vibrating with anticipation. Then, barefoot, she'd step into the center circle, not as a monarch, but as a conduit. Her arms would rise, her waist would shift, and the drummers would follow her rhythm, not the other way around. And when she danced, it wasn't for entertainment. It was invocation. Historians still argue whether these dances held true political significance or were symbolic acts of seasonal ritual. But one Portuguese missionary wrote, "I have seen more men fall to their knees before a single sway of her hip than I have seen tremble before God." That may be exaggeration, but only slightly, because while colonial officials tried to translate her movements into anthropological terms, they missed what the people already knew: her dance was a declaration. The rains came not because she prayed, but because she moved. And she didn't move alone. The queen was surrounded by spouses, women, and sometimes men chosen for their beauty, intelligence, and loyalty. They weren't romantic partners in the conventional sense. They were extensions of her power. Some served as caretakers of the sacred lake where rain rituals began. Others were her food tasters, ceremonial dancers, or dream interpreters. One young woman, recorded in a 19th century journal, was described as the Queen's Whisper. Her job was to sit beside Mojaji during rituals and repeat her thoughts in song. Imagine that, your thoughts, echoed musically by a lover sitting so close her breath became yours. And then there was the beer. brewed only during specific moon phases, using maize soaked in spring water collected before sunrise. It wasn't just a drink. It was prophecy in liquid form. Only those who participated in the brewing were allowed to serve it, and only the Rain Queen could drink the first cup. Before sipping, she'd dip her fingers into it and anoint her temples. This act wasn't decorative, it was signaling. If she drank and nodded, the ritual continued. If she frowned, the whole ceremony paused, because her taste was treated as divine calibration. The beer was believed to carry the spirit of the land, and the queen's mouth, the land's translator. One year, after a long drought, the queen reportedly held a private ceremony. No drums, no audience, just her, a single spouse, and 2 clay pots of beer. For 3 nights, the spouse bathed her in river water, sang lullabies of ancient rains, and helped her drink until they both fell asleep on a bed of wet grass. The rains came the next day. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe intimacy isn't always thunderous. Sometimes it's soaked into the earth while everyone's asleep. A curious tradition during rain rituals. The queen's body would be painted not with dye, but with mud from 3 separate rivers. Each river symbolized something different, one for fertility, one for memory, one for boundaries. The spouse who applied the mud did so while singing her childhood name over and over, reminding her of who she was before she was queen. The idea was that power shouldn't erase identity, but return you to it. That's not just intimacy, it's radical leadership. Colonial authorities, of course, couldn't comprehend it. They tried to label Mojaji as a tribal oracle or a mystic matriarch, but they didn't understand why regional chiefs, many of them men with armies, bowed their heads when she entered the room. They didn't see how her authority was carried not by edict, but by scent, the way she smelled of lemongrass, firewood, and salt. One British official, after visiting her court, reportedly refused to speak for hours. When asked why, he muttered, "She looked at me like the sky does before it breaks." That's not intimidation. That's weather as woman. Quirky detail. The Rain Queen was forbidden to marry, but she had lovers, chosen through a rite called the shadow choosing. At dusk, when the sun was low, a group of potential partners would walk past a fire, casting shadows onto her hut's wall. She wouldn't look at them, only their shadows. The one whose outline moved her would be summoned. No words exchanged, just silhouette recognition. It was said to reflect true essence, not just physical form. She ruled in the light, but chose in shadow. There's no record of her raising a sword, issuing a decree, or leading a march. Yet Mojaji's line persisted longer than many militarized kingdoms. Rain came, crops grew, her people thrived. And when she died, they didn't build a stone monument. They planted a circle of trees. Because she didn't need to be remembered in rock. She was remembered every time the sky darkened and the wind shifted sweet. And so you sit now beside the sacred lake, feeling the mist rise, wondering what it must be like to rule through rhythm, to lead not by pushing people forward, but by pulling the earth toward you. That's what Mojaji did. She ruled through fertility, through silence, through moisture. Her power wasn't about dominance. It was about attention, how she could make the sky watch her, make the crops respond, make you lean in closer just to hear her hum. She didn't command with words. She commanded with rain. And when the fields turned green, nobody asked how. They just said thank you. Now you find yourself in a different kind of kingdom, one that doesn't parade its queens in gold or place them on thrones. Instead, this kingdom, deep in the heart of what would become KwaZulu-Natal, is ruled by absences, pauses, and a gaze so cold it could still a battlefield. This is not a court of warmth or sensual perfume. No, this is the reign of a queen mother whose greatest power was precisely that she refused to be touched. You are entering the shadow of Shaka Zulu, the man known for turning spears into scalpels and warriors into a psychological war machine. But behind Shaka's thunderous footsteps, there's a woman who rarely spoke, never laughed, and seduced a whole empire into obedience without ever laying a hand. Her name was Nandi, and her intimacy, if you can call it that, was built on the edge of absence. You walk now through a Zulu village where every man is clean-shaven and tight-lipped, and even the air feels instructed. The scent of cattle dung and boiled maize clings to your clothes. Somewhere nearby, boys are being circumcised with little ceremony because Shaka has outlawed most rituals, deemed them distractions. But that law did not come from nowhere. It came from a wound. And if you trace it back, it leads not just to Shaka's traumatic childhood or battlefield trauma, but to his mother, Nandi, who turned emotional detachment into an entire system of governance. She wasn't technically queen, she was queen mother, which in Zulu hierarchy made her something between a spiritual spine and a matriarchal oracle. But make no mistake, she ruled. Every major decision made by Shaka passed through her silence. And when she did speak, it was brief, icy, devastating. She was known to enter a room and freeze conversations just by standing there. Men who had slaughtered enemies in war would lower their heads in her presence like guilty schoolboys. The intimacy here wasn't touch, it was proximity. Nandi was known never to embrace anyone after Shaka's rise. She didn't take lovers. There's no record of a second partner. No romantic gestures, no flirtation. And yet, those closest to the court described her presence as possessive, like a drought. She didn't seduce with sweetness. She seduced with control, emotional, spatial, psychic, and to her people, that made her invincible. There's a tale that one of Shaka's commanders once offered Nandi a marriage proposal, thinking it would elevate his status. She listened, expressionless, then asked him, "Do cows weep for vultures?" the next morning. He was reassigned to a cattle post on the farthest edge of the kingdom. No explanation, just wind. Her power was reinforced through ritual. Every year on Shaka's coronation anniversary, Nandi would perform a silent walk through the capital. No one spoke. No drums played. She walked barefoot through rows of soldiers who had been forbidden to blink until she passed. One Portuguese observer claimed the walk was more terrifying than war. Because it wasn't celebration, it was a demonstration of restraint as power, and this restraint extended even into her own grief. When her daughter died, Nandi refused mourning rites. No wailing, no tears, no rituals. Just 3 days of fasting and a single song hummed into the night. After that, she never said her daughter's name again. Historians still argue whether this was stoicism, trauma, or a calculated performance to maintain her image. But the effect was clear. People began to associate emotion with weakness, pleasure with compromise, and affection with danger. Her relationship with Shaka was equally complex. She praised him rarely, corrected him always. When he proposed expanding military raids into neighboring territories, she asked simply, "Is your heart empty, or just your hands?" He paused the campaign. That's not maternal concern. That's political steering masked as a question. Yet, despite her coldness, Nandi's influence extended even into matters of sexual policy. She helped design the celibacy requirements of Shaka's military regiments, which banned warriors from marrying or engaging in sex until after age 30. This wasn't religious, this was strategic. Nandi believed that desire made men hesitate. That affection compromised fury. And so, intimacy became a delayed currency, dangled before warriors as a post-war reward. She turned longing into loyalty. And perhaps the strangest tale of all, Nandi once held a ceremony for a group of young women chosen to serve in the royal household. These weren't concubines, they were cupbearers, servants, advisors in training. Before induction, she made them fast for 7 days, then led them to a river where each was instructed to release a strand of hair into the current. The symbolism, they were surrendering vanity, desire, and personal ambition to the river gods. From that point forward, they belonged to the state. One initiate later described the feeling as being kissed by silence and forgetting what lips are for. That's not love. That's indoctrination through intimacy's absence. And here's a particularly eerie quirk. Nandi was known for staring contests. Literally, if a warrior was suspected of betrayal or emotional compromise, she would summon him, sit across from him, and simply stare. No accusation, no guards, just silence and that flat, unblinking gaze. Some men confessed crimes she hadn't known about. Others fainted, One reportedly fled the kingdom entirely. She didn't have to raise her voice, her pupils did the cutting. Even the architecture around her was built to enhance this eerie power. Her residence had no doors, only tight curtains of woven grass. You didn't knock, you waited. And if she pulled the curtain aside and looked at you, that was permission to speak. If she turned away, you left. It was said that just waiting in front of her home made grown men feel like lost boys again. The tragic irony, of course, is that all this control became unsustainable. When Nandi died, Shaka lost his grip on restraint. He ordered a national mourning period that banned sex, planting crops, and even smiling. Women who became pregnant were executed. Entire families fled. It was as if her absence revealed just how much structure her cold presence had provided. The very intimacy she denied became the kingdom's most profound longing. And in that longing, everything started to unravel. Historians debate her legacy. Was she a broken woman who hardened into myth? A grieving mother who used silence to protect her son, or was she a political genius who knew that in a world where women were touched, taken, and talked over, the sharpest power came from being untouchable? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. Nandi taught a nation how to obey through discomfort, how to desire approval that never comes, how to love from a distance, someone who never said I love you back. And as you stand now at the edge of what was once her village, the wind picking up dust around your ankles, you feel it, her presence, still cold, still watching, still reminding you that sometimes the most seductive power is the kind that refuses to touch you at all. Now the sand beneath your feet turns pale and fine, and the sound of the ocean creeps into your ears like a whispered secret. You've arrived at the Swahili coast, where cities rise not from stone and sword, but from coral and language. Here, the sun doesn't scorch, it shimmers, casting soft gold onto domed mosques and carved wooden doors so ornate they look like stories frozen mid-sentence. You walk through the alleys of Kilwa, Lamu, Mombasa, Zanzibar, each a jewel in the necklace of trade routes that stretched from Mozambique to the Persian Gulf. And at the heart of these cities, hidden behind silk curtains and coconut-woven walls, are the women who didn't just sleep with sultans, they wrote the scripts for entire economies. This isn't the story of harems, it's the story of how intimacy, in the hands of coastal queens and consorts, could steer ships, broker treaties, and sink alliances, quietly, fluently, strategically. You enter one such home now, barefoot as the etiquette requires. The floor is cool coral stone, and the scent of sandalwood burns gently from a brass dish. There's laughter beyond the curtain, high-pitched, warm, deliberate. A Swahili courtesan is reciting a love poem she composed just that morning, one that compares the tides to a man's loyalty and mangoes to his breath. Her audience, a visiting merchant from Gujarat and a minor Arab emir's cousin. They're eating with their fingers, drinking spiced coffee, and not realizing they're in the presence of a political conduit. This woman, her name might be Asha, or Salama, or Fatma speaks 5 languages. She's slept with 4 different envoys, and she's not been kept, she's been keeping track. Swahili women of the ruling class and upper urban tiers wielded an unusual amount of autonomy. Unlike their counterparts in many parts of the medieval world, they owned property, initiated divorces, and, perhaps most intriguingly, ran trade negotiations often from their bedrooms. The architecture of Swahili homes reflected this: the outer courtyards for guests, the middle rooms for family, and the innermost chambers cool, perfumed, and lined with carved wooden chests for business of the flesh and the fleet. One Portuguese sailor wrote in his logbook that his instructions from a local sultan were to always consult with the mistress of the third room before concluding any shipment. That's not euphemism, that's policy. Historians still argue whether these women were formally trained in diplomacy or if their influence emerged organically through repeated proximity to power. What's undeniable is their linguistic prowess. Some learned Arabic at 7, Persian by 10, and could read and write in Ajami script, a form of Arabic adapted for Bantu languages, pillow talk. In this setting, came with footnotes. One legend tells of a woman named Bibi Tatu who was said to recite Quranic verses mid-climax, followed by trade advice whispered directly into her lover's chest. That's not kink, that's strategy. One account, buried in an old Omani journal, describes a Swahili woman who seduced a rival emir not through physical contact, but by repeatedly sending him folded notes, each perfumed with clove oil and written in flawless Nabatean Arabic. Each note contained a verse of poetry and a veiled critique of his trade policy. After 6 weeks, he sought her out. She refused to see him until he agreed to renegotiate coral prices. They met once, privately, for less than an hour. The next day, tariffs changed. A particularly fascinating practice. Night weaving. This wasn't literal loom work. It was a metaphor for how Swahili women stitched alliances by taking multiple lovers from different trade cultures: Persian, Arab, Indian, African. Each lover brought goods, gossip, and offers. The woman became the node. And like any skilled weaver, she made sure no thread pulled too tightly. If one lover grew possessive, she'd remind him gently that tides always shift. That's how a city like Kilwa, no bigger than a small town by modern standards, could punch above its weight in the Indian Ocean world. Its queens and courtesans weren't just decorating the palace. They were running the map. Even the fragrances they wore were coded. Ambergris for those courting loyalty, jasmine oil when diffusing tension, and civet musk when initiating seduction. A seasoned courtesan could walk past a guest and announce her intention with scent alone. One contemporary Arab traveler noted that when Fatma wore jasmine, it meant Oman would get its pearls cheaper, but only if she kissed your cheek after tea. These were not passive gestures. They were negotiations in chemical form. And don't imagine these women as lonely, draped in shadows. They hosted salons, intellectual gatherings where poetry, politics, and prophecy mingled over dates and coffee. Think of them as ancient TED Talks with a more impressive dress code. One salon gathering, according to oral tradition, once debated whether the stars dictated trade winds or whether trade winds shaped destinies. The speaker was a woman named Mwanidi, who reportedly countered both by saying, "Neither. It is the woman's tongue that determines arrival." No one disagreed. There's a quirk from one 15th century chronicle. Some of these women used mirrors, not just for appearance, but for reflection rituals. Before meeting a new lover, they'd sit alone in candlelight and whisper a question to the mirror. It wasn't superstition. It was focus. A mental rehearsal. A reminder that even in moments of bodily closeness, their minds must stay 3 moves ahead. One mirror, now in a museum, still has a Swahili proverb etched along its rim. Lips are soft, decisions are harder. And it wasn't just external diplomacy. These women shaped internal politics too. When succession disputes arose, it was often the women of the court who decided which nephew, cousin, or brother received their quiet support. Their endorsement wasn't shouted, it was implied through presence, phrasing, or which feast they attended. One young prince once believed he had inherited the throne, until the main courtesan refused to sit beside him at his coronation feast. The next morning, his older brother took his place with full support. Were they always successful? Of course not. Some were poisoned, others exiled. But even in downfall, their reputations lingered. In Zanzibar, there's still a folk saying, "Beware the woman who smiles in 5 languages." It's not a warning against treachery. It's respect for precision. And so you sit now at the edge of the coast, watching the tide pull back like the hem of a lover's robe. You imagine these women multilingual, perfumed, unrecorded, shaping the fate of ships with a single gaze. They didn't need armies or crowns. They had rooms full of maps, drawers full of scented letters, and beds that served as both refuge and conference table. They didn't shout. They whispered. And the world listened. Now you're high in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, where the sky presses close and the wind sounds like a warning. You pass through stone arches etched with ancient Ge'ez script, into a royal compound that smells of cinnamon, incense, and something fainter fear, perhaps. Inside the palace, guards whisper in riddles and eunuchs avoid eye contact. Because the queen here doesn't rule with decrees. She rules with disappearance. One wrong word, one misjudged glance, and you're gone. No trial, no spectacle, just a quiet funeral without a body. Tonight, you'll watch her at work, not with soldiers, but with seduction. Her tool of choice, a poisoned lover's fan, carved from ivory and dipped in just enough toxin to still a heart mid-kiss. This is not Cleopatra's theater or Njinga's overt ritual. This is quiet tyranny, where intimacy is a weapon you never see coming. And yes, some called her mad. Others called her holy, but everyone called her queen. Her name, you're told, is Sable Wengel, but the records argue. Some say she ruled during the Solomonic dynasty. Others think she's a composite of multiple queens. Historians still argue whether she existed as one woman or as a story stitched together by men too embarrassed to admit they were outmaneuvered by silk and perfume. But you walk her halls now, feeling the polished obsidian under your feet, and you understand whether she was real or legend. She left fingerprints. She wasn't a conqueror. She was a spider. Her web wasn't land, it was trust. She seduced only when necessary, only when a secret needed uncovering or an alliance needed dissolving. Her lovers, men of rank, merchants, even visiting clerics never suspected they were being played. Because she never flaunted beauty. She wore modest robes, kept her head low, spoke in half phrases, but every detail was deliberate. The fan, always in her hand, carved from rare white wood, was said to be enchanted. It wasn't. It was dipped in crushed castor bean and powdered oleander enough to kill slowly. Days later, with symptoms that mimicked heartbreak, it wasn't used often, only when forgetting wasn't enough. One such case appears in an old monastic ledger. A bishop from Axum, praised for his sermons, arrived to counsel the queen on female modesty. Days later, he died mid-mass, clutching his chest. No accusations were made, but the queen's fan disappeared for a week. When it returned, the palace servants noticed it smelled faintly of cloves. You hear rumors that she held secret salons in a room behind the chapel, accessible only by a hallway lined with mirrors. Not for vanity, for distortion. As you walked, the angles bent your reflection. By the time you reached her, you no longer looked like yourself. That was the point. The queen would sit, hands folded, listening as guests confessed things they didn't mean to say. She called it the unburdening. It began with flattery, then gossip, then strategy. And when the conversation ended, you were offered tea, a sweetmeat, and a moment alone with her if you were deemed useful. The intimacy wasn't always physical. In fact, the mystery was part of the seduction. One nobleman wrote that he spent 7 nights in her presence and left untouched but completely disarmed. He gave her trade routes, land rights, and a promise to redirect soldiers, all in exchange for what one whispered prayer, a smile, and the scent of myrrh on his robe. That's power beyond comprehension. That's intimacy as ideology. There's a peculiar ritual you learn about from an elderly servant's diary. The queen hosted a midnight gathering once a season, where select guests were blindfolded, led to a candlelit chamber, and seated in a circle. They were asked a series of personal questions about loss, desire, fear. If you lied, the room went silent. If you told the truth, someone touched your hand. The queen never revealed herself. She listened. And the next day, decisions were made, appointments changed, prisoners released, or more subtly, someone vanished. One guest later wrote that the experience was like being undressed with no hands. And then there's her most infamous case, the disappearance of a Portuguese envoy. He came with gifts silver, velvet, a cross studded with glass jewels, and a request for military alliance. The queen entertained him for 2 weeks. They dined together. He read her verses in Latin. She taught him proverbs in Amharic. They were seen walking in the garden once, side by side, never touching. Then, one morning, he was gone. His ship remained docked, his belongings untouched. When asked, the queen said only, he returned to the silence that made him. That line is still quoted today in Ethiopian politics whenever a diplomat disappears from the news cycle. Quirky detail. She never ate at banquets. Instead, she had her meals in the garden alone, always the same time, always the same dish lentils with honey. A strange combination, but said to be symbolic softness and sting in one bite. And always from a bowl carved with a spiral pattern, meant to remind her that every act of kindness must loop back into control. Even her most intimate gesture offering someone her fan was loaded with meaning. If you received it and returned it, you were protected. If you kept it too long, it meant you were being watched. One young courtier, eager to impress, kept the fan as a love token. A week later, he fell ill. He survived, but never spoke again. Not because he couldn't, because he wouldn't. His last words were said to be, "She knows the temperature of my dreams." Historians debate whether this woman was a tyrant, a mystic, or simply a master manipulator. But the oral traditions insist she ruled without cruelty, only precision. No torture, no spectacle, just patterns. If a rebellion stirred, it disappeared before the first drumbeat. If a betrayal brewed, the guilty man would find a letter on his pillow unsigned, but unmistakable. And if anyone asked how she knew these things, her advisors would shrug. She listens better than the wind. And now, standing in her garden centuries later, the air still smells faintly of myrrh. You think of the lovers who entered her chamber, confident and left confused. You think of the men who whispered about her control but could never replicate it. You think of that fan silent, elegant, deadly. And you realize she didn't kill with poison. She killed with precision, with timing, with the terrifying intimacy of being known too well. She didn't need an army. She had attention, and she used it like a scalpel. Now the jungle thickens around you, humid and heavy with the scent of cocoa, kola nut, and crushed marigold. You're deep in West Africa now, within the emerald heartbeat of the Ashanti Empire, where golden trinkets aren't just ornaments, they're declarations. The earth beneath you is red with iron and memory, and in the center of this buzzing kingdom, built on trade, ritual, and absolute reverence, sits a queen who doesn't walk unless the gods say so. You approach a courtyard where the drums are already trembling, where dancers move in slow rotations around a single stool unassuming in shape, carved in perfect symmetry, and entirely sacred. This is the golden stool, the soul of the Ashanti nation, and beside it, veiled in silk the color of thunderclouds, sits the Queen Mother, not a figurehead, not a symbolic presence, but the woman who decides what the king will dream about tonight. Her name is Nana Ya Asantewa. And yes, she led a war, but tonight you won't see her with a rifle. You'll see her in silk, leaning into her enemy's drink with a smile so layered you'll never taste anything the same way again. Ya Asantewa is known for standing up to the British in the early 20th century, but that's only the final act of her performance. Long before the war drums, she was already ruling from the shadows, using her role as Queen Mother, not just to advise, but to orchestrate. In the Ashanti system, Queen Mothers held real authority. They nominated the king. They dismissed him. And when they spoke from beside the golden stool. As its guardian, not just physically, but spiritually. You don't inherit that power. You prove yourself worthy of it. And Ya, as she was known before the Asantewa was added, did it not by shouting, but by seducing the court with clarity, loyalty, and a touch of theatrical thunder. There's a story never confirmed, but passed like gospel among griots, of the time she ended a trade dispute not with argument, but with a dance. Two rival factions were seated at opposite ends of the royal court, refusing to compromise. Ya entered wearing layered gold jewelry so heavy it clinked like a warning. She didn't speak. She began to dance slowly, tracing the outline of the stool, never touching it. As she moved, the drummers picked up her tempo, her eyes fixed on one man, then the other. And when the final beat struck, she poured wine into both their cups, toasted to what matters more than pride, and sat beside the stool. By the end of the day, the dispute was over. That's not negotiation, that's choreography. Intimacy here was ritualized, strategic, and completely public. During the annual Odwira festival, the Queen Mother often took a prominent role in libation ceremonies. While the men made offerings of food and coins, she would offer silence, her gaze locked on the king or the chief priests, her face unreadable. And if she nodded during your speech, it meant you had her favor. If she smiled, your enemies became nervous. But if she leaned in and whispered into your ear, as she often did with her allies, the court would fall silent. Because when the Queen Mother whispered, the gods were believed to be listening too.
Her personal relationships were carefully selected, unlike in European courts, where queens were often expected to maintain chastity or marry for alliance. Ashanti queen mothers had the right to choose lovers discreetly. Ya was known to favor men of intelligence, not birth scribes, advisors, even the occasional foreign emissary. But her most curious partner, according to local oral tradition, was a goldsmith. Not a noble, not a warrior, a man who touched molten metal for a living. He supposedly fashioned her a private pendant shaped like a calabash, the vessel traditionally used to serve palm wine, and in this case, used to symbolize the body as both container and mystery. Every time he visited her chamber, she wore that pendant. Every time she wore it, policies shifted. One particularly strange and telling anecdote comes from a court servant who claimed that Ya would sometimes host private tastings of new palm wine batches, always in threes. She would invite 2 local chiefs and 1 foreign trader. The wine would be served in identical cups, but only one would contain the original undiluted brew. The queen would observe reactions. The one who identified the real wine earned her trust. The others politely dismissed. It was a test not just of taste, but perception. She wanted to know who could sense depth beneath sweetness. Historians still argue whether her rise to military leadership was spontaneous or long calculated. The official narrative says she stood up during a meeting when all the men hesitated, declaring, "If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we, the women, will." But those who studied her more closely suggest that the ground had been prepared for years. Her private network of alliances woven through rituals, feasts, and yes, intimate dinners ensured that when she did rise, no one could block her. She didn't just stand up. She stood where she already knew she was safest. And the golden stool, it was never meant to be sat on. It hovered, held aloft on its own sacred power. But Ya was said to have touched it once, not in defiance, but in prayer, resting her fingers gently along its edge before war council. One elder recalled that moment. She did not move the stool, but the stool changed her. That line is still recited today during ceremonies, and it captures her essence perfectly. She never overstepped. She recalibrated the space around her until it bent to her rhythm. There's even a story half legend, half memory about a British officer who tried to flatter her during early negotiations. He complimented her earrings. She nodded. He compared her skin to polished mahogany. She smiled. Then he said, "Surely a queen as beautiful as you must long for peace." She looked at him, blinked once, and replied, "Peace is like wine. If you're not careful, it tastes like surrender." That officer returned to his ship early. His report listed her as an unpredictable threat. Translation: she didn't fall for it. Quirky tradition. Ya believed in footwork divination. After a long council session, she'd retreat to her quarters and walk barefoot across a mat sprinkled with ash and crushed kola nut. The patterns her feet made, tracked by her closest handmaid, were interpreted as omens. Curved lines meant success. Crossed lines meant delay. Straight paths. Decision. She never explained the rules, but everyone knew when her walk was followed by a new policy. And when the British finally came for the golden stool, she didn't blink. She didn't beg. She planned, not from a war room, but from a candlelit chamber scented with burning shea butter and red clay. Her closest advisors said she prayed. Others said she braided her hair while reciting the names of her ancestors like war drums. And when the fighting began, she didn't lead from the front. She led from the center, eyes sharp, heart steady, and every word wrapped in purpose. Because Ya Asantewa wasn't just a queen. She was the breath behind 1,000 decisions, the pause between gestures, the pressure behind a gentle smile that could break your resolve in 5 seconds flat. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to seduce. She simply showed up, full of purpose, cloaked in memory, and everyone around her adjusted. Now you're walking into wind. Not the soft kind that nudges your clothes like a curious cat, but the relentless desert gusts that slap and hiss, reshaping the dunes and your expectations by the second. You are deep in the Sahara now, where the sky stretches so wide it forgets its own name.
The land belongs to the Tuareg, those blue-robed nomads who ride like shadows and speak in proverbs sharper than blades. But tonight, you're not following a caravan. You're entering the tent of a matriarch, a queen without a crown, whose authority is written not in law, but in sand, tongue, and silence. You step into the camp of a woman known only as Tin Hinan. Her name means she of the tents. But don't let the modesty fool you. She is queen of the impossible ruler of mirage and memory. And if you think desert queens don't seduce, you've clearly never had to negotiate with someone who knows exactly how much water you have left.
The Tuareg society flips expectations. While many cultures hand power to men and intimacy to women, here it's the women who inherit the tent, the land, the lineage. And that reversal does more than confuse outsiders. It creates a society where control isn't imposed but internalized. You walk into a tent, low-ceilinged, fragrant with goat hair and rosewater, and Tin Hinan doesn't rise to greet you. She stays reclined, eyes half-lidded, her fingers trailing a bead chain across her lap. That bead chain. It's a ledger. Each bead represents a camel, a trade route, a rival chief's mistake. She doesn't need to shout. She just needs to name a color.
She wasn't born into power. Legend says she crossed the desert on foot, pregnant, exiled, accompanied by a servant and a lion. A literal lion. You can choose whether to believe that part. But what matters is what she built a base camp near Abalessa, a site that became sacred not because of its size, but because she made it magnetic. Traders stopped there not because it was convenient, but because she made them feel they were being watched. Her tent was reportedly positioned so that the entrance always faced the rising sun. Anyone who approached did so against the light, half blinded, half humbled. Her methods of intimacy. Disarming. She'd offer you goat's milk laced with crushed cardamom and a soft hand gesture toward the pillows beside her. You'd sit, trying not to sweat, trying not to offend. She wouldn't touch you. But she'd ask, very softly, "Do you speak to your camels when no one else listens?" And suddenly, the conversation isn't about salt trade anymore. It's about memory, about how deeply she's already read you, and how badly you now want to be understood. She didn't have a harem. She had suitors, temporary, rotational, and entirely replaceable. One Tuareg tale says she kept 3 lovers at any given time, one for conversation, one for strategy, one for dreams. Each slept in a separate tent, never together. They were not allowed to approach her without invitation. One was reportedly an astrologer who spoke only in metaphors. Another was mute, but played the imzad, a one-stringed violin, so soulfully it made camels cry. The third, a caravan leader who tattooed her initials in tiny dots along his inner thigh. She rewarded him with a rare night in her own tent, beneath a ceiling draped in indigo and stars. Quirky detail. Her perfume was said to be made from powdered meteorite mixed with goat tallow and dates. Was that even possible? No idea. But it smelled like the kind of myth you'd never want to forget. Travelers wrote home about it. One even tried to recreate it using graphite and cinnamon. Failed miserably. Ended up with a rash and a new respect for desert chemistry. And her most whispered power was the use of letters. Tiny, folded notes passed in water flasks or sewn into clothing. She wrote in Tifinagh, the Tuareg script, but disguised her handwriting so cleverly that even fellow scribes couldn't match it. One love letter, reportedly found years after her death, said only this: "Your mouth lied, but your heartbeat confessed, no signature." But no one doubted who wrote it. Tin Hinan's court, if you could call it that, was mobile, but precise. Her caravan was said to move like a school of fish, no visible signal, no obvious leader, but somehow always coordinated. And when she stopped, pitched her tent, and summoned a guest, that guest knew 2 things: you were being invited into a conversation, not a conquest, and you might not leave the same person. One Moroccan merchant wrote that she could make a man rethink his loyalty with a single sip of tea. Her tea ceremonies were infamous 3 cups, served in silence, each slightly stronger than the last. The final cup, she said, was for truth. If you didn't finish it, you were hiding something. If you did, she'd smile and ask no further questions.
But she'd remember your answer the next time the trade routes shifted mysteriously in your favor or vanished overnight.
And then, there was the sandstorm affair. Legend says she once seduced a rival leader during a storm so thick, no one could see more than a foot ahead. They met in a tent pitched hastily, alone, no guards, just two people sharing warmth in a world that had turned to dust. He expected to leave with her alliance. He left without his caravan. No one knows what happened inside that tent, but afterward, he abandoned leadership, retired to the coast, and took up beekeeping. He claimed the desert changed him. Others claimed Tinhinin simply whispered his fears back to him until they swallowed his ambition. Historians debate her legacy. Some say she's a composite figure, stitched from fragments of matriarchs who led different clans. Others argue she was real, buried in a tomb found in the 1920s. Her bones resting beside silver jewelry and a mirror that faced down. Always down. A mirror that refused to reflect anything but earth. To the Tuareg, she's more than real. She's the breath between verses in their epic poems, the pause in a camel's blink before a storm. They still speak of her decisions. A young woman choosing her first lover might be advised to walk like Tinhinan, meaning, don't hurry, let the world adjust its rhythm to yours. Her leadership wasn't loud, it was layered. She didn't demand loyalty. She created spaces where it grew, where you wanted to offer it just for the chance to sit beside her in the quiet. Because she wasn't just a queen, she was the logic of the desert, wrapped in indigo and silence. She knew when to speak, when to kiss, and when to leave a man alone with only the wind and his regrets. Now you're climbing into the green hills of Lesotho, where the mountains aren't jagged but soft, folded like a blanket laid across the shoulders of the sky. It's quiet here, no screaming drums or charging armies, just the wind whistling through long grass, the rustle of cattle bells, and the occasional laugh of a shepherd echoing down the valley. But don't let the peace fool you. Beneath this calm lies one of the most sophisticated systems of silent rebellion ever conceived. And at the heart of it is a queen you've never heard of, who never issued a decree, never wore a crown, and never declared war, but still ruled with breathtaking precision. Her name is Mamohato, or sometimes Manchabo, or sometimes no name at all. Because her legacy isn't chiseled into monuments, it's stitched into births, into perfume bottles, and into the names men give to daughters when they know who really held the reins. The Kingdom of Lesotho, formerly Basutoland, has always been a land of negotiation, surrounded by more powerful neighbors, invaded by missionaries, courted by colonizers. It survived by learning when to speak and when to stay still. And the queens here mastered that stillness into a tool sharper than a spear. You find yourself now in a rondavel circular, thatched roof, the smell of wood smoke and dried peaches in the air, and across from you sits a woman in her 50s. She's wearing a wool shawl, her hair wrapped, her eyes soft but unreadable. There are no guards, no throne. But make no mistake, she's reading you like a ledger. She doesn't shout orders. She asks questions like, have the rains been kind to your fields? And somehow from your answer, she'll know whether your loyalty can be bought. This is her court kitchen fires, shared meals, whispered advice that circles back weeks later as policy, and when she chooses to act. It starts with a scent. Yes, a scent. Lesotho queens are known for blending their own perfumes. Nothing mass-produced, always local herbs, wild mint, sage, mountain lavender, sometimes ash from a ceremonial fire. One woman, remembered only as Mi Oakabo, was said to anoint her inner wrists with a mix so subtle that you didn't smell it until you were already listening too closely. Her scent was like a hook in a soft song. It made you want to lean in. And that's when she'd ask the question that ruined your plan. One of her most iconic moves involved a quiet pregnancy. The story goes that a rival chief tried to manipulate land rights by marrying his daughter into her bloodline. The queen accepted, smiled politely, but then months later, revealed her own secret pregnancy, one she'd conceived through a lover who carried stronger lineage claims. She gave birth in silence, named the child after a river that no longer flowed, and overnight, reshaped the entire inheritance structure of the region. No war, just biology, weaponized with precision. This tactic strategic motherhood was a recurring theme among Lesotho's royal women. Intimacy here wasn't about seduction for pleasure, it was about timing, ritual, and planting seeds both literal and political. The queen might sleep with a man once, years after he thought he'd earned her trust, and only when she was ready for the consequences. Because for her, every child was a chess move, and every night she chose not to share a bed just as powerful.
There's a quiet practice, still whispered about, where a queen would sleep alone with a necklace of dried herbs under her pillow basil, wormwood, and lemongrass. This wasn't for dreams. It was to train the mind to listen, to dream in ways that revealed not symbols, but strategies. She'd wake in the morning and interpret what she heard in the rustling leaves outside. If they sounded like footsteps, she prepared for visitors. If they sounded like laughter, she sent a gift. No visions, no prophets. Just environmental intimacy practiced like a second language. Quirky detail. These queens used song as surveillance. A select group of elder women trusted allies. Not servants would attend markets, weddings, and beer gatherings, singing traditional songs laced with modified verses. The verses acted as coded reports. If a trader was gossiping about royal weakness, the verse might change from "The cow walks slowly to the river. The cow returns without water." It sounds innocent. But when the queen heard that line from across a courtyard, she knew exactly who to silence, bribe, or marry into compliance.
Manshabo Siiso, one of the best documented queens of Lesotho in the 20th century, served as regent from 1941 to 1960. She navigated colonial manipulation, internal factions, and a global war not by force, but by baffling every British official she met. One governor wrote in a letter, "She listens with perfect stillness, then replies with a parable about goats. You leave with no idea what she's agreed to." That was the point. Her intimacy was verbal, emotional, occasionally physical, but always delayed, always selective. One night, during tense negotiations with a colonial representative, she served him a bowl of porridge. As he ate, she spoke softly to a servant about the moon, about how it disappears but always returns. The man, confused, finished the meal, went back to his quarters, and found his suitcase packed. No confrontation, no insult, just porridge, moon talk, and exile. He left the next morning. The British called her frustratingly opaque. Her people called her the wind that bends trees. And still, historians debate her methods. Did she rule through manipulation or instinct? Was her control over succession and land rights rooted in tradition or pure cleverness? The records are frustratingly incomplete letters, meeting minutes, a few black and white photos, but the oral histories remain vivid. Women in Lesotho still teach their daughters how to answer a question without giving anything away. They call it fighting with fog. Intimacy in this context is not about availability, it's about timing. These queens mastered the art of delay. A man might be invited for dinner 3 times before he realized he was being evaluated. Not for wealth, for consistency. Did he speak differently when the food changed? Did he ask too many questions about other men? The queen noticed. She always noticed. And if he passed, he might find himself on a walk with her at dusk, where she'd reach for his hand, not as a gesture of romance, but as an unspoken pact. "You're in. Don't mess this up." And when they needed to make someone disappear, it wasn't with blades or banishment. It was with reassignment. A lover might be sent to oversee sheep in a faraway village. A minister quietly retired with a generous harvest. No scandal, just redirection. One historian called it bureaucratic ghosting. And honestly, it's brilliant. So now you sit, miles above sea level, in a hut warmed by fire and quiet decisions. The queen beside you pours tea from a kettle that smells of mint and old paper. She hasn't asked you anything. She doesn't need to. She already knows why you're here. She's just deciding if you're worth the answer. And maybe that's the lesson. Power isn't always loud or immediate. Sometimes it's a bowl of porridge, a change in lyrics, a baby born with timing too perfect to be coincidence. These women didn't rule by declaring authority. They ruled by slipping into the gaps between words, by placing their fingerprints on systems no one realized were being rewritten. And if you're lucky, you'll leave this mountain with nothing more than a scent on your clothes and a memory of someone who barely touched your hand but changed your life anyway. Now you're drifting westward toward the coast of Senegal, where the air thickens with salt, sugar, and the long echo of drums muffled by lace curtains. This isn't a court in the traditional sense, no throne room, no gold-plated arches. This is a colonial port city in the 18th century, where French officials swagger through whitewashed buildings while trying not to sweat too visibly. But inside the stone mansions, behind mosquito-netted beds and painted shutters, a very different kind of empire is being built, where queens don't wear crowns, but corsets, don't issue commands, but invitations, and don't march armies, but slide contracts across silk-covered tables. This is the world of the Signorais, Senegalese women who became some of the most powerful courtesans, traders, and political tacticians of the era. Tonight, you're entering the bedroom of one such woman, where the bedposts smell faintly of cloves and the curtains flutter like secrets. Signorais derived from the Portuguese senhora, meaning lady emerged from the mixing pot of colonial glory in St. Louis. These were women of mixed African and European heritage, many born to African mothers and European traders or soldiers. But while the men came and went, the women stayed and built empires. Signorais weren't mistresses in the passive sense. They were co-conspirators, estate owners, trade magnates. Some historians still argue whether their relationships with European men were acts of survival or autonomy. But when you step into their world, it becomes clear they weren't surviving colonization. They were quietly rewriting its rules. You're ushered into a 2-story stone house, cooled by shadow and the steady breeze of a servant fanning from the corner. The woman before you, Madame Ndé, is dressed in layers of French fabric stitched with local dyes. Her neck is wrapped in gold beads, her hair piled into a style both Parisian and Wolof. She doesn't rise to greet you. She gestures instead to the seat beside her chaise. And already you've made a mistake by sitting too quickly. She notes that everything here is theater, and you've stepped into the performance 2 beats too early. Her companion for the evening is a French merchant with badly polished boots and the confidence of a man who thinks he's in control. But Ndeye leans in close, pours him bissap sweetened just enough, and casually mentions that her cousin owns the riverboats. A beat passes. He blinks. He's starting to realize that pillow talk here includes logistics. Signorais often entered formalized unions with European men called marriages à la mode du pays marriages in the custom of the country. These weren't casual affairs. They came with dowries, property transfers, mutual obligations, and most importantly, they made the women the legal intermediaries between European capital and African markets. One Dutch captain reportedly said, "You do not trade in Gorée unless a woman lets you." Simple, true. Intimacy was just the hook. What followed was negotiation under silk sheets. The bedroom became boardroom, after sex, while her guest was still woozy with affection and brandy. Ndeye might ask, "What's the real price of palm oil this week?" And he'd answer, "Because vulnerability makes information leak." Later, she'd use that intel to renegotiate cargo contracts with a competing British trader. If he complained, she'd smile and say, "Your numbers must have been whispered wrong." Nothing hostile, just softly devastating. And the seduction wasn't always physical. Many Signorais were fluent in French, Wolof, Portuguese, and even basic Arabic. They could switch dialects mid-sentence to exclude or include, to charm or confuse. One notable Signorais named Anne Pépin was said to have 3 parrots in her house, each trained to curse in a different language. A joke, yes, but also a warning. Don't assume she didn't understand you. Quirky tradition. Signorais would host public promenades every Sunday, dressed in their finest. They'd walk slowly through the center of town, arm in arm with their servants, letting everyone Europeans, locals, rivals see their status. But it wasn't just about clothing. They wore specific jewelry to communicate mood coral beads for business, gold hoops for flirtation, pearls for mourning, and black jet when preparing for a breakup. And if you were the man being dismissed that week, you'd find out not from a conversation, but from the earrings. These women weren't isolated. They built networks across Gori, St. Louis, and as far as Banjul. Signories wrote to one another, warning about unreliable partners, advising on tariff changes, even sharing recipes for aphrodisiac stews. One such recipe still whispered today involved ground kola nut, cloves, dried shrimp, and a dash of French wine. Makes them talk. The margin note read, "Not fall in love, talk." That was always the goal.
There's a particularly sharp story about a Signare who discovered her partner, a French naval officer, was secretly funneling arms to a rival trader. She didn't confront him. She invited him to a dance. Halfway through the night, she slipped out, handed his ledgers to a British captain, and by morning, the Frenchman's ship was denied dock access. He never learned how she found out, but he never underestimated lace curtains again.
Historians debate whether Signares were complicit in colonial systems or quietly subverting them. After all, some participated in the slave trade, others freed enslaved people and employed them as artisans and clerks. The truth is messy, but what's undeniable is that these women took the roles given to them: courtesan, concubine, housekeeper, and turned them into portfolios. They weren't welcome at colonial councils. So they built power where no one was looking in bed, in markets, in the space between yes and no. Even their mourning was strategic. When a partner died or returned to Europe, a Signare didn't weep publicly. She hosted a feast. She burned his letters in a brazier laced with jasmine, danced once in a silk robe, then returned to business. One observer described it as the most graceful rejection of grief I have ever seen. And within a month, she'd often be courted again, not just for beauty, but for access. Everyone knew to be with her was to gain a door. Whether you walked through it or got stuck halfway depended entirely on how well you could keep up. The intimacy they offered was layered, yes, physical warmth, but also curated attention, economic foresight, and cultural fluency. They remembered which ports had bad customs agents. They memorized your rival's favorite dish. And they knew when to laugh, when to go quiet, and when to say, "I hope you find what you're looking for," which everyone knew meant goodbye. You walk back out into the humid night now, the scent of jasmine still clinging to your sleeves. The drums have started up again, but you're too dazed to dance, because you understand something new. Some queens rule with spears, others with fans, but the Signares ruled with silence, softness, and perfectly timed affection. Not because they were powerless, but because they understood the real game was never about conquest. It was about staying, and stay they did. Now the canopy closes in above you, and the sun becomes a rumor. You are deep in the Congo Basin, where the air hangs like a wet curtain and the ground pulses with ancient memory. The trees creak, not because they're old, but because they've been listening. This is not just a jungle, it's a kingdom. And in the clearing ahead, smoke curls from the roof of a thatched hut marked with white paint symbols. Spirals, hands, open eyes. Inside, bone rattles click against each other in the dark. Not randomly, but with intention. You step into a space where the line between prophecy and pillow talk is about to dissolve completely. Tonight, you meet a queen whose power doesn't shout. It whispers in rhythms only the body understands. Her name has long been forgotten, but the women of the region still refer to her simply as Mfumukazi ya Mfumu, the queen of the spirits. And she's about to read a future you didn't know you were carrying. She doesn't wear gold. Her adornments are bone and brass, beads the color of blood oranges in midnight. You sit on a mat of woven palm fiber, watching as she enters the hut without sound. Her body is painted with ash and clay, her eyes rimmed in crushed charcoal. She doesn't smile. She doesn't greet you. She places a bowl of water between you both and drops a carved pelvis bone into it. It spins. You're not here for a reading, not really. You're here to understand how this queen ruled not with swords or coins, but by deciphering what people moaned in the night. The Kingdom of Congo and its surrounding cultures have long valued dream interpretation as a form of governance. But this queen took it further. Her lovers weren't chosen for companionship, they were chosen as oracles. Men who had vivid dreams, men who talked in their sleep, men whose breathing rhythms changed under pressure. Her night rituals weren't about seduction. They were about harvesting information emotional, political, prophetic. One ritual, repeated by the Bakongo griots, tells of the queen lying beside a man while holding a polished skull against her belly. The skull, often of a revered ancestor, was believed to act as a translator between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. As the man slept, she would press her palm to his chest, timing her breath with his. If he spoke, she'd whisper the words back to him, mapping meaning onto memory. If he shivered, she'd place herbs under his tongue mugwort, cola leaf, dried pepper to invite further visions. In the morning, she'd rise before him, light a candle made of palm wax, and dictate her orders for the day. Whether trade route shifts or the naming of children, her choices were justified with a phrase she repeated often. The night told me, and no one questioned it, because in her kingdom, dreams were not fantasies. They were strategy. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuine mysticism or politically engineered theater, but the results were measurable. Her reign saw reduced tribal conflict, more equitable trade with Portuguese envoys, and a consistent birth rate even during famine years. One visiting priest wrote, "She speaks rarely in council, but when she does, the room listens like a church during storm." That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. And then there was the bone reading, the most iconic part of her rule. After each night spent with a lover, she would take animal bones often, chicken or monkey, and toss them onto a circular cloth. How they landed told her what had been absorbed. Not just physical signals, but vibrations. A curved rib over a straight vertebra meant betrayal. A clean break in the bone meant hidden knowledge. If the bones scattered too far, the man was thinking of another woman. She never asked him. She just didn't invite him back. Her tent, her room, her sanctuary, whatever you call it, was more than a place to sleep. It was an archive. Bones labeled and stored, nightshirts folded and bound with color-coded thread. Even bed sheets were saved, dried, burned, or buried depending on the encounter. One sheet soaked in tears became an offering. One soaked in blood became a curse. That's not superstition. That's power management with linen. Quirky habit, she never spoke her own dreams aloud. If asked, she would say, "I dream for you, not with you." Meaning her role wasn't to be seen, it was to see. Her closest advisors were mute by choice. They communicated through symbols, painted on gourds. One gourd for harvest, one for marriage. One never touched unless absolutely necessary. For war. That gourd had been opened only once in her reign. It was closed the next morning. She didn't keep concubines. She kept dreamers. Men who stayed in her compound only as long as their dreams remained vivid. The moment they began to sleep soundly, they were sent away. Not out of cruelty, but because their usefulness had passed. You ruled this kingdom by collecting the fragments people dropped in sleep. Not by pleasuring them, but by letting their subconscious speak while they believed themselves safe. There's one particularly haunting story. A Portuguese trader, curious about her powers, offered himself for a night. He drank her tea, made with wild yam and honey, and fell into such a deep sleep he began speaking in Latin. She listened. She recorded. In the morning, she told him she knew where his ship was docked, how many cannons it carried, and what disease his first mate was hiding. He left without finishing breakfast. That night, she rewrote her trade contracts. And there's another tale, more local, more intimate. A boy orphaned during a border raid was brought to her court. Too young for labor, too traumatized for conversation. She let him sleep beside her for weeks, feeding him quietly, letting him curl against her spine. He began to speak in sleep, telling stories, naming rivers, describing cities he'd never visited. She listened. He became her cartographer. The first maps of her kingdom came not from explorers, but from dreams. Even her death is dreamlike. Some say she didn't die, she dissolved, disappeared into fog one morning, leaving behind a single bowl of water and a bundle of bones wrapped in silk. Others say she died in sleep, smiling, hand pressed to her heart as if feeling the pulse of the world. But what they agree on is this: no one replaced her. Not because no one wanted to, but because no one dared to dream that precisely. In the Congo today, some women still follow her methods in private. They call themselves Bene Nzoto, daughters of the body. They gather on new moons, burn sweet herbs, and lie beside each other in silence, waiting for the night to speak. They say if you dream of bones clicking in water, the queen is watching. And so now, back in her hut, the candle flickers low. She leans close not to kiss, but to whisper. What your mouth hides, your breath reveals. You inhale. She listens. And you realize she's not reading your future. She's reading the part of you you've tried hardest to ignore. Now, the desert heat has given way to dry breeze and shadowed courtyards. And the air smells of old paper, dates, and worn leather. You're walking through the narrow alleyways of Timbuktu, once the intellectual capital of West Africa, where stone houses stand close enough to whisper to one another. This city was never ruled by kings in the way you might expect. Here, the real power sat in the back rooms of libraries, in the folds of headscarves, in conversations behind the woven mats that separated market stalls from homes. And tonight, you're going to meet the queens who never called themselves queens, the women who shaped one of the world's great centers of knowledge without ever sitting on a throne. These are the whispering queens, the ones who ruled through secrets, trade, memory, and the most dangerous form of intimacy, intellectual intimacy that doubled as seduction. They weren't married to kings, they were married to paper. You enter a room lit by a single oil lamp, its light dancing across the surface of hundreds of manuscripts. Islamic jurisprudence, astronomy, medical texts, erotic poetry, Sufi mysticism. And among these scrolls sits a woman in deep indigo, her hands stained with ink, her wrists jingling softly with silver. She doesn't look up as you enter. She's writing. You sit, you wait. Because this queen doesn't measure your worth by your title, she measures it by how long you can stay silent. In Timbuktu, during the 14th through 16th centuries, literacy was power. And some of the most well-guarded libraries in the city belonged not to men, but to women, heirs of knowledge passed down in matrilineal lines, often in secret. These women were not scholars by profession. They were scholars by inheritance, stewards of texts that the world would one day forget, then desperately try to recover. And many of these women were also concubines, an economic, political, and intellectual arrangement unique to the West African Sahel, where concubinage wasn't always about submission. Sometimes, it was a scholarship. A woman might be taken into the household of a wealthy merchant or a Qadi Islamic judge, not as a servant, but as a companion trained in Islamic law and ethics. She would manage correspondence, interpret religious texts, and advise on trade law. At night, she might share his bed. But by day, she was translating Arabic into Songhai and Wolof, copying manuscripts, and hosting visiting scholars for tea. Intimacy here was both literal and metaphorical close reading, close listening, close holding of secrets. One account tells of a woman named Zainabu, who managed a merchant library with over 300 manuscripts. She was known for never speaking directly to male visitors. Instead, she'd leave written notes under their tea bowls. If she approved of a trade proposal, the paper smelled faintly of hibiscus. If she disapproved, it smelled like nothing. That's not just aesthetic, that's system design. And she wasn't alone. There are records thin, fragmented, but persistent of women copyists who inked religious texts with a signature flourish, a curve in the final letter of Allah's name that identified the scribe as female. They weren't just preserving scripture, they were preserving presence. In a society where female authorship was often erased, they wove themselves into the margins, literally. Quirky practice. The manuscript pillow, a tradition where lovers or spouses, particularly literate women, would place a rolled-up scroll under their pillow before sleep. Not to read, to absorb. The idea was that knowledge could soak into the subconscious, and according to some oral histories, it worked. One woman reportedly woke from a dream reciting an Arabic poem she'd never studied. When asked how, she said, "The pillow whispered." From then on,
the phrase pillow scholar became a term of admiration.
These whispering queens weren't all born free. Some began as slaves, taken into households, taught to read as part of their duties, and slowly rose to prominence not through rebellion, but through intellectual accumulation. One such woman, known only by her praise name, She Who Watches the Margins, was said to be able to recite the Quran, predict sandstorms by the movement of cats, and advise on trade policies with Morocco, all without ever stepping outside her compound. Visitors came to her, lovers waited for her letters, and rulers consulted her when logic failed. Sex bing, in this realm, was often negotiated like scholarship. A man might court a woman not with jewelry, but with riddles. If she solved them, he could visit again. If not, the door remained closed. One famous riddle: what walks in daylight but dreams in ink? The answer: a woman who writes. And if she gave you that answer, you were already in love and 2 weeks behind in negotiations. Historians still argue whether these women were truly autonomous or simply beneficiaries of soft patriarchy. But what's certain is that they shaped the culture from within. They edited treaties before they were signed. They recited verses during childbirth. They corrected imams mid-sermon, sometimes with a raised eyebrow, sometimes with a footnote passed after prayers. And they chose their partners not by wealth, but by grammar. A man who misquoted hadith was never invited back. One particularly sharp story, a French explorer in the 1800s, seeking access to a manuscript archive, offered its female guardian a pearl necklace. She declined. He then offered her horses. She declined again. Finally, he offered to marry her. She paused, then handed him a note that read, "What value is your name when your memory is so short?" He left the city 2 days later, empty-handed. Quirky detail ink recipes. These women guarded ink recipes like spellbooks, one kind for public writing. Smooth, brown, meant to fade slightly over time. One for love letters, deep black, scented with lemon, meant to smudge if touched. And one for private theological work. Blue-black, made with iron and dates. That never faded. If you received a note in this third ink, you kept it, because it meant the writer believed you would last longer than parchment. And they were right. Much of what we know about Timbuktu's golden age comes from texts preserved in these private libraries. Texts that were saved, copied, hidden, smuggled by women who were never officially named, but always remembered. Some buried their scrolls in clay jars beneath kitchens. Others sewed verses into robes. One manuscript, hidden in a mattress for decades, was discovered with a single line underlined in red. The secret lies not in conquest, but in careful listening. And so now you sit beside one such queen, not with a crown, but with a pen, her hand steady, her eyes tired but sharp. She asks you a question, but only with her silence. Can you keep a secret? Can you write your truth in the dark, trusting that someone centuries from now might find it and understand? Because these queens never ruled by force. They ruled by margin, by ink, by knowing how to make you feel seen with one glance and undone with one sentence. They didn't need armies. They had archives. They didn't need to shout. They wrote it all down and waited for the world to catch up. Now you're standing under a canopy of dark clouds, thick with thunder waiting to crack open the sky. You're in a part of pre-colonial Central Africa where the trees grow wider than houses and the air carries the scent of steel, sweat, and sap. This is not a quiet place. This is a kingdom on the brink, where war drums pound like heartbeats and blades gleam at dusk. But you're not here to watch warriors. You're here to follow the women who rode with them war wives. They were called not queens in title, but queens in function. Their power wasn't worn on their heads, but carried in their hips, their chants, and in the way they made love like they were reading battle plans off your spine. Tonight, you'll witness something that even generals feared: orgasmic omens, divination through ecstasy, and the way these women made climax part of command. Among certain Bakongo and Luba communities, sex was not separate from strategy. Women of royal or spiritual lineage were expected not only to counsel chiefs,
but to anchor their confidence through a practice known as insight coupling, an act that was part intimacy, part vision quest. It wasn't sex in the modern transactional sense. It was a ritual, a decoding of breath, shudder, sweat, and post-coital silence into real decisions about war, territory, and vengeance. The warrior might carry the spear, but his mind returned each night to a woman who mapped his fate with her body. You enter the hut of one such woman, lit only by the soft flicker of animal fat candles. Her skin is painted with ochre and ash. Her wrists clink with iron bangles, and there's a thin red thread tied around her ankle, a symbol of both fertility and prophecy. Her name might be Kanyembo, or Lolo, or Zawadi, but what matters is what she can do. You sit across from her and she doesn't speak. She just breathes, long and slow, the way you're supposed to before reading a battlefield. War wives were chosen not by lineage alone, but by their capacity to enter a trance state through intimacy. They were trained to observe not just the act, but the pulse. Was the partner's breath steady or rushed? Did he tense on his left side or right? What name did he murmur when he thought he was alone in his climax afterward? She'd lie flat on a mat, arms open, and recite what she'd heard, not just words, but feelings. He is hiding fear in his chest. He is thinking of escape. His vision is in flame. These were not metaphors. These were strategic assessments. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or isolated, exaggerated or underreported. But oral traditions are firm. These women didn't just soothe, they scanned. They didn't only satisfy, they diagnosed. Their beds weren't soft. They were altars. And many a military maneuver began with a moan. One especially sharp tale comes from the Kuba kingdom. A famous war wife named Nama reportedly spent an evening with a visiting general from a rival clan. They shared millet wine, touched palms, and by midnight, she was arching beneath him while whispering riddles. In the morning, she told the king, his rhythm is desperate, his hands speak retreat. The king delayed the attack by a week. 7 days later, the rival army fractured from within. No battle needed, just a woman who understood how anxiety leaves fingerprints across your collarbone. And yes, there were actual omens tied to orgasm. One tradition held that if a man climaxed while biting his lip, it meant disloyalty was near. If he held his breath, he was withholding information. If he wept, he was haunted by ancestors. Women were taught not to interrupt these moments. Let it unfold. Read it like a sacred text. Then choose what to do next. Quirky technique. The use of echo bowls. After sex, a war wife would fill a clay bowl with water and gently stir it with her fingers while chanting her lover's name. If ripples spread clockwise, the future was favorable. If they spiraled inward, betrayal or death was near. The bowls were passed down through generations, sometimes cracked, sometimes rimmed with ash, but always used, because water remembers. And this wasn't done in secret. In many courts, these women sat at council meetings, not in the front, but near enough that their coughs, glances, or quiet laughter could shift the tone of a discussion. One chief once announced war plans with full confidence until a war wife simply crossed her legs. No one moved. He changed the plan the next day. That's not superstition. That's a system. Even the language changed in their presence. Among the Lunda people, there was a verb kalumba that meant both to climax and to foresee. The logic that ultimate release could trigger ultimate vision. And these women trained their bodies not just for pleasure, but for clarity. They learned how to stay conscious in that moment, how to receive and retain flashes of color, memory, and emotion. One woman described it like this: in that breath, I saw his father, and his fear, and the path he would walk. Not every woman in the kingdom was expected to do this. It was a role, trained from adolescence, usually among those chosen by lineage or unusual sensitivity. They were not concubines. They were commanders in silk. If you mistook their role, you were either exiled or re-educated by force or humiliation. One foreign missionary who mocked a war wife was found the next day lost in the bush, speaking only in proverbs. He returned to Europe shortly after,
One especially fascinating aspect was their role in negotiation. Before envoys were sent or treaties signed, war wives were often brought in to spend an evening with the leaders involved. Not to spy, not to charm, but to balance the fire. As the saying went, if a man slept well, spoke honestly, and awoke calm, it meant the talks could proceed. If not, the delegation was recalled. One woman said, "It's in the way his feet twitch. If he kicks while he sleeps, he will kick over the table." Diplomacy as bedtime audit. Even their death rituals were designed to honor their roles. When a war wife died, her favorite pillow was burned with incense, and the man who shared her bed last was expected to fast for 3 days, not for guilt, but to reflect on what she had absorbed. If he dreamed of her, the dream was recorded. If he didn't, it was said she had taken his silence with her. In some regions, shrines were built to these women, not grand, just stone circles with clay figures representing the womb, the sword, and the ear. Offerings were left honey, feathers, tears in small gourds. And young girls would visit these shrines before marriage, asking not for beauty or obedience, but for insight. To be the kind of woman who doesn't ask questions, but receives them before they're spoken. So now you lie beside one such queen, the candle flickering, the air thick with sandalwood and storm. She's not touching you, she's just breathing, timing your pulse, reading you like a terrain map. Tomorrow, a decision will be made where to march, who to trust, when to wait. And she already knows the answer. Because some queens didn't need to wear armor. They just needed to hold you close long enough to hear what your body never wanted to say out loud. Now you're perched in a shaky colonial boat on the Gambia River. Moonlight dancing on the swollen water as mosquitoes hum like tense violins. You step onto red clay at midnight, just as smoke curls from the village chimneys and the earth smells like roasted groundnut and ambition. The place is a social club disguised as a riverfront settlement, where French flags flap next to local totems, and drums from both traditions beat in an uneasy duet. This is late 19th century Senegal, in the shadow of colonial expansion. And walking through the lantern-lit huts of this mixed community, you're about to overhear how African queenship found a secret weapon in courtesans. Some called them Senegalese courtesans of the resistance. Tonight, you'll discover how colonial diaries misheard blueprints for liberation as flirtation, and how intimacy bent steel empires by trading bed for blueprint, lullaby for map. You pass the curving wooden doors of a compound belonging to Awa Sise, a woman renowned for her beauty, her wit, and her uncanny network of contacts. Her home is built of mud and stone, tiled with Portuguese ceramics, and draped in fabrics shipped from India. Smoke pours from cooking fires as servants stir potions of baobab oil and mint tea. The fragrance smells innocent, or at least, that's what they want you to think. Inside, the hall feels like a salon, where local traders, French officers, griots, and Muslim scholars mingle over kola nuts and sweet bissap. Awa moves among them gracefully, a hand on one lean, inedible politician's shoulder, a word in Wolof to a French lieutenant. She's not dancing. She doesn't need to. Her step alone makes people lean in. Signories have set the tone in Senegal for centuries. But Awa belongs to a new generation who call themselves Signories Resistantes courtesans who flirted not just for trade, but for secrets. Intimacy was their entry, their way into caravans of information that colonizers never jealously guarded. Awa spoke flawless French, Mandinka, and even had working knowledge of Portuguese, enough to pretend ignorance when it benefited her. She carried miniature ciphered letters, pressed menstrual folk riddles, folded into fans that European lovers squeezed during dance before handing over details about troop movements. Historians still argue whether Signories Resistantes actively staged sabotage, or if they merely held leverage that slowed colonial oversight. In Awa's case, sometimes both. One French diary entry complains that the woman smiles at my uniform, but feeds my men information that empties our stockpiles. The clerk underestimates who she is. He doesn't know she slipped unforgettable ecstasy into his nights, enough that he spent half the next day fogged when military orders were rewritten by other hands.
That wasn't a slip. That was a reprogramming.
On one humid night, an engineer arrives with blueprints for a railway line. Awa escorts him into a silk-draped room, pours him mint tea, and listens to him lament difficulties with black elephant grass along the embankment. She leads him to a shade tree on her terrace that towers above such grass and casually suggests using termite-resistant bamboo instead. He notes it. He carries it home. His line runs later, but runs. Her lovers were never permanent. She chose 3 per season, the clerk, trained in records and maps, the lieutenant, fluent in military reports, and the merchant, who counted goods and taxes. Each was assigned an animal totem gazelle, Ipo, eagle symbols people knew, but colonizers never noticed. Each animal's story, woven into evening songs, served as mnemonic for coded routes, hidden resources, or spies. For half-sleep oral history, it all sounded poetic. For her, it was policy, and the colonizers rarely questioned a lullaby. In her bedroom, you hear lullabies. Some are old Wolof chants. Others are lullabies she learned from enslaved women who escaped into her compound. One cradle song promises, "The sun will not find you where I hide your map." The engineer who learned it still dreams it sometimes, and wakes with sweat because some secrets are pressed into the subconscious. Quirky detailed her bracelets, one for each connection. She wore 13 each night. If a lover broke trust, she removed one visible only when she crossed her arms. One European observer journaled that she danced without bracelets one night. Next day, a French expedition vanished upriver. He labeled it coincidence, but for those in the know, the missing bracelet spoke louder than musk or gunpowder. One night, she deliberately triggered a misunderstanding. A French captain overheard a private conversation, La Rivière est souillée, about river contamination. He assumed it literal. He withdrew his men pending investigation. Meanwhile, Awa's people built a dock deeper upriver. They laughed at the misdirection. For Awa, misheard whispers were better than war drums. The diaries don't record her name properly. Many Frenchmen called her La Veuve Charmante, the charming widow, after she'd spun a tale about losing a husband in a battle against rival traders, but never specified whether he existed. She spoke of him in letters, folded into fans. The story made colonizers sympathetic. It gave her cover. Sympathy, in their minds, was access. Historians debate whether this was deception or necessity. But what's clear is that Awa and her circle deliberately built a hidden network of courtesans' resistance. They shared information secretly through tea recipes, through lullabies, through coded scarves. Colonialism moved slowly around their webs. Among oral historians, she's called the Queen of the Sand Mappers, because the earth shifted under her will, roads routed, taxes delayed, rebels hidden without armies or treaties. Only through proximity, templates like hers were passed to queens across the river in sometimes bloody coups, sometimes peaceful transitions. But they always remembered Awa's rule not by law, but by love worn as armor. And sometimes, colonial officers would raise their glasses to toasts. "À la reine," they'd say, and she'd smile. Because it didn't matter whether they saw the crown. She knew where they buried it. As the boat takes you back across the moonlit water, the lanterns of her compound fade, but the lullaby's soft syllables against the hull linger. Because you realize that some empires fell not with cannon fire. They fell with a whisper. Now you lie beneath a velvet sky, the edges of consciousness fraying like silk unwinding. And you remember the rise and fall of empires that never bled on battlefields, but on mattresses, in whispers, in the soft press of skin against skin. You drift back across thousands of miles from Timbuktu's inked margins to Tuareg tents, from Zulu silence to Rain Queen rain calls, and beyond, along this path, there's a thread that runs through every story power made sensual. Resistance cloaked in intimacy, rule hidden in touch. And here you are now, half awake, half dreaming, vulnerable, unguarded, just as every one of these queens intended you to be. Your bed feels deeper than any throne, your breath easier than any treaty. Maybe you're in Lomé, Lagos, Lusaka, or maybe you're somewhere else entirely. But you carry each queen's gift within you. Cleopatra's understanding that myth is muscle, Amanirenas' lesson that a scar can be authority, Njingas that performance rewrites souls, Makedas that silence can be louder than any riddle, Diyas that ceremony can fracture reality, Nubian priestesses that intimacy can steer divine judgment, the funerary queens that ecstasy can seal eternity, Mojajis that rain can follow a dance, Nandis that absence can define presence, Swahili courtesans that a glance can betrayed, Sabla Wengels that precision can cut deeper than poison, Ya Asantewaz that purpose can unseat empires, Tin Hinans that lineage can ride the wind, Manchabos that scent can decide life, Awa Siseys that softness can rewire colonizers, and the war wives that climax can reveal truth. These women ruled not because the world allowed them, but because they rewrote its rhythm. Tonight, as you drift, feel the echo of their methods ripple through your dreams. Let their strategies guide your own inner world. Remember, quiet does not equal powerless, and softness is not surrender. Maybe your mind will wander through a desert caravan and feel the drag of sand underfoot, or slide into a moonlit hut where silence holds more power than speech. Allow those moments to settle, because in the dark, beneath the surface, that's where control lives, and that's where sovereignty begins. Your breath slows, your eyelids grow heavy. Let the images fade gently, like curtains closing on a play you've already starred in. Rest into the complexity they offered you, the reminder that femininity is not fragile, intimacy is not innocence, and rule can be found in the space between a whisper and a touch. Sleep now, with the knowledge that power can be soft, strategic, sacred. The world might tell you to shout, but tonight you've learned something quieter.